Coldwater Territory. The last days of 1879. Fire licked along a dry wooden wall, and not one soul, within a mile, heard the horses scream through the smoke. Someone had said it. Someone knew exactly which night the watchers would finally sleep. But this story doesn't begin with fire. It begins with a crumpled scrap of paper, passed hand to hand around a long table in a cold kitchen, under the laughter of 7 girls who'd learned to laugh before anything funny had even been said. Fair pay. Someone read it aloud, like a joke told twice, and just as poorly the second time. In this territory, every cruel joke eventually finds its way back to the same door. Falls into the lap of the same girl sitting alone in the shadow the lamp doesn't quite reach. She kept her eyes down. Down was safe. She had no way of knowing that an hour's walk away, behind a ranch gate, a man had just hurled something hard enough to shatter against a barn wall. And that before the year was out, both their names would be written into a debt 20 years old, and neither one of them would walk away from it the same. Coldwater Territory. Late in the year, 1879. The stove in the boarding house kitchen had gone cold an hour past supper. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared enough to feed it. 7 girls crowded the long table instead, and a single scrap of paper passed hand to hand between them like it was made of gold instead of pulp and ink. Cedar Ridge Ranch. Help wanted. Barn work. Fair pay. Fair pay. Loretta Vance said the words like a joke somebody had already told twice, and badly, both times. She turned the paper over in her hands, as if the real truth of it might be printed on the back, where nobody could see. For working under him? Somebody laughed. Somebody always laughed first in this kitchen, before anyone had actually said anything funny, because laughing first was its own kind of currency, and currency didn't wait around to be earned. My cousin worked out there, another girl put in. 2 weeks, and he threw a horseshoe at her head. Near took her ear clean off. I heard he broke a man's jaw with one punch. I heard he doesn't speak. Not to nobody. Not since he came home from the war. Ruth Callahan sat where she always sat. Corner stool, pulled back a careful 2 feet from the table, close enough to hear every word, and far enough to disappear into the shadow the lamp didn't quite reach. A torn apron lay across her knees. A needle moved through the fabric in her hand, slow, patient, the only part of her that ever seemed to move without hesitation. She kept her eyes down. Down was safe. Down meant nobody's gaze caught hers, and decided on a whim that it wanted to stay there a while. Because that was the trouble with a kitchen full of pretty, sharp-tongued girls with nothing much to do after supper. They were hunting animals whether they meant to be or not. And hunting animals, every single time, found the slow one first. Ruth. There it was. The voice, sweet the way spoiled milk is sweet in the half-second, before you catch the smell underneath it. Ruth's hands went still on the apron. Just stopped, mid-stitch, needle half buried in the fabric like it had frozen there on purpose. You're not doing anything tomorrow. Are you? Not a question. Loretta didn't traffic in questions. She built statements shaped like traps, and waited for people to walk into them of their own accord, which was, Ruth had come to understand, over 4 long years, the cruelest kind of trap there was. Ruth's throat closed a little, the way it always did right, before it mattered most that it didn't. I have the mending. The mending can wait. Loretta was already up, already across the room, snatching the notice off the table like she was doing the whole kitchen a favor by claiming it first. She carried it over. Dropped it into Ruth's lap the way a person drops something dead they don't want touching their own hands a moment longer. You'll go clean the rancher's barn. Silence for exactly 1 breath. Then the room broke wide open, every girl talking at once, over each other, through each other, the words tangling, into a single bright roar of cruelty that Ruth had learned, over the years, to let wash past her ears like weather. She's built for it, isn't she? All that lifting. All that bending. Maybe she'll get stuck in the doorway. A voice, from the back of the room, delighted with its own cleverness. He'll have to grease the frame just to pull her out again. The kitchen roared. Actually roared, the sound of it filling every corner, bouncing off the cold stove, and the low ceiling, and coming back at her twice as loud. Ruth sat with the notice crumbling slowly in her lap, and felt her whole face go hot enough that she half expected the paper to catch fire straight off her cheeks. She opened her mouth. Tried, with everything in her, to say no. Nothing came out. Just a stutter, sitting on her tongue heavy, as a stone dropped down a well, waiting for a splash that never arrived. It settled then. Loretta clapped her hands together once, satisfied, the exact sound a woman makes closing a deal she knows she's won. You leave at first light. Don't be late. And don't you dare come back until the job's finished. And if he throws you off the place, somebody else added, not even bothering to look at Ruth anymore, already drifting toward the next piece of gossip the way flies drift toward whatever's sweetest in the room. Well, that's your problem, isn't it? And that was that. The whole table turned away from her at once, the way a wave pulls back off wet sand, and leaves you standing there, stranded, holding a scrap of paper that might as well have been a sentence handed down from a judge's bench. Ruth folded the notice. Smaller still. Pressed it deep into her apron pocket like she could will it out of existence simply by making it small enough to disappear. She wanted to stand up right then. Wanted to say I won't go, wanted to say you can't make me do this, wanted to feel the words leave her mouth clean and whole for once in her life instead of catching halfway up her throat like a fishhook snagged on something raw. Except where would that leave her? No family left breathing anywhere in this territory, or any other. No money saved past the few coins hidden in the toe of her second boot. This boarding house, cold stove, and cruel girls, and all, was the only roof standing between her and the open road, and Ruth Callahan had learned a long time ago exactly what happened to girls who argued with the only roof they had. She thought of Opal. 2 winters back. Opal, who'd stood up at this very table and said no, I won't, and who'd been standing on the front porch by sundown, with her single trunk, and nowhere left to carry it to. So Ruth said nothing. She climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, where the roof sloped down, so low near the far wall, that she had to duck to keep from cracking her skull against the beams, the way she'd been ducking every night for 4 years now, until her body had learned the motion, without her mind having to ask it to. She lay down on a mattress that had given up any pretense of softness a long time before she'd ever arrived to claim it. 4 years. She'd been 16 when she came through that boarding house door, an orphan twice over, once when her mother passed, and once again a handful of years later, when her father followed, coughing into a rag that came away a little redder with every week that turned. Her father. She thought about him more than she ever let herself admit out loud, more than made sense for a girl trying to survive one more winter in one more cold attic. He taught her letters at a kitchen table by lamplight, back before the fever took her mother, back when they'd had a kitchen table at all, back when they'd had a house that belonged to them instead of one they were only ever borrowing space inside. He'd taught her numbers too. Columns. Sums. The particular satisfaction of a ledger, that balance clean down to the last penny. A mind for figures is worth more than a pretty face, Ruthie. He used to say it, tapping one ink-stained finger against the page, like he was driving the words home with a nail. Pretty face fades on you. Figures never lie. She hadn't touched a proper ledger in 5 years. Didn't seem the sort of thing anybody in this territory wanted, from a girl built the way she was, a girl who scrubbed floors and mended aprons for the privilege of a roof and 2 meals a day. Above her, in the dark, the roof beams sat black against a blacker night. She stared up at them the way she always did on the nights sleep wouldn't come easy, listening to the wind test the shutters downstairs, hunting for some crack in the wood it could slip through. Built for heavy work, they'd said. Can't even fit through the doorway. She pressed one hand flat against her own chest, and felt her heart going far too fast for a girl who was only lying still in the dark, doing nothing at all. "Why?" she whispered, so quiet the empty attic could barely catch it. "Was I made this way?" No answer came. Just the wind. Just the old house settling around her the way it did every single night, groaning low in its bones like it was every bit as tired of standing as she was tired of staying. She didn't remember, later, the exact moment sleep finally took her. She woke to voices. Downstairs. Low. Careful in that particular way people get careful, when they don't want to be overheard, which was, Ruth had come to learn, precisely the kind of careful that wakes a light sleeper faster than any amount of shouting ever could. She lay still. Listened. Mrs. Pemberton's voice came first, flat, businesslike, the same voice she used every first of the month collecting rent, a voice built entirely for transactions, and never once, in all Ruth's 4 years under this roof, for kindness. "She'll be out at that ranch the better part of a week, if I've got any say in it. Keeps her out from underfoot around here." Out of earshot, too. A second voice. A man's. One Ruth didn't recognize at all. Low. Unhurried. The particular calm of a man who had spent a great many years growing entirely accustomed to being obeyed the first time he asked for anything. "See that she stays there. Whatever that takes. You worry about your end of things, mister. Don't say my name inside this house." A pause stretched long enough that Ruth realized somewhere in the dark she'd been holding her own breath, without ever deciding to. "The arrangement stands?" Mrs. Pemberton said at last. "You keep the payments coming regular. I keep the girls exactly where you want them. Simple as that ever needs to be." Footsteps. A door easing shut, careful, quiet. The particular creak the front step only ever made when someone left the house well, after dark, trying hard not to be noticed leaving. Ruth lay frozen along, while after the house had gone fully silent again. She didn't understand what any of it meant, not really. Arrangement. Payments. She turned the words over in the dark like river stones, looking for some shape underneath them, and found only more dark waiting on the other side. Because that was the trouble with other people's secrets. You could hear every last word of one, and still not have the first idea what it actually was. She told herself, twice, it wasn't any of her business. Told herself a third time for good measure, until the telling nearly, almost, worked. Almost. Dawn broke the color of an old bruise. Gray first, then a deep aching purple, then a thin hard yellow crawling up along the far edge of the hills. Like the sun itself wasn't entirely convinced the day was worth the trouble of showing up for. Ruth dressed in her oldest work dress. Tied her hair back, with a ribbon that had frayed past any hope of saving itself a full year ago, and simply never got thrown away, the way plenty of things in her life had outlived their usefulness, and stayed anyhow, out of stubbornness, or habit, or the simple lack of anything better to replace them with. She slipped down the stairs, before the other girls had stirred, because if she'd had to face Loretta's particular morning smile one single time more, before she'd even cleared the front door, she thought there was a real chance she might finally say something she couldn't take back. Better by far not to find out. The walk to Cedar Ridge Ranch swallowed the better part of an hour. Her shoes hadn't been built for that kind of distance, and her feet let her know it well, before the half-mile marker, and hadn't stopped complaining by the time the fence line finally swam into view, split rail, silvered gray with age, running out across low rolling hills dotted here and there with grazing horses. Bigger than she'd pictured it. Bigger, and quieter, and, though she hated to admit, as much, even privately, even to herself, almost beautiful in the flat gold wash of early morning light. Then she heard it. A crash. Sharp. Wood striking wood, or wood striking something a good deal harder than wood. Then a voice, rough and furious, cutting clean through the cool morning air like a blade drawn fast through cloth. "Damn useless!" Another crash, louder than the first. Ruth stopped dead at the gate, one hand closing around the top rail, the cold iron latch biting into her palm. Through the open barn doors she could see him. A man, tall, built the way a mountain is built, meant for hauling weight rather than for being reasoned with. shirt sleeves shoved up past both elbows. A broken wagon wheel gripped in his two hands, and even as she watched, frozen, he hurled the whole ruined thing clean across the barn, where it struck the far wall, and came apart in a spray of splinters skittering across the dirt floor. He stood there afterward, chest heaving like a bellows worked too hard. Fists still closed tight at his sides, like he hadn't yet decided whether he was truly finished, or only catching his breath, before the next round. This was him. The devil rancher. The man who'd fired 3 hired hands inside of a single week. The man everyone had always known, on some level. This exact joke was ultimately going to land on her doorstep, because that was where every cruel joke in this territory eventually ended up finding its way, straight to Ruth Callahan's front door. She thought seriously about turning around. Both feet had already half-turned toward the empty road behind her, before she'd even fully decided to think it. Then he saw her. His eyes came up, and found her standing there at the gate, and everything in him seemed to go still all at once, the particular stillness of a storm deciding, in one held breath, whether it means to keep building, or simply break apart entirely, right there, right now. "What are you doing here?" Not a greeting. Not within a country mile of one. Her mouth opened, and the words tangled the exact way they always tangled, precisely when it mattered most, that they didn't. "I was sent to clean the bee barn." His eyes narrowed. Sent by who? The boarding house. They said you needed help. He studied her a long moment, a muscle working hard in his jaw, tight enough it looked fit to crack a walnut clean in half. Then he laughed. Short. Bitter. Nothing remotely funny sitting behind it. "They sent you." Flat. A statement, not a question at all, as though he'd already worked out the whole shape of the joke, without needing her to explain a single word of it. Ruth felt her face go hot clean through. She knew exactly what he was looking at. She'd seen it reflected back at her in enough mirrors, enough sideways glances, enough kitchens just like the one she'd left behind this morning, to know the shape of it by heart, blind, in the dark, without needing a single lamp lit. Slow. Soft. A joke wearing a dress. He turned away from her. Dragged one hand back through his hair, hard enough it looked like it must have hurt. "Go home." "What?" "I said go home." He didn't turn back around to say it. "I don't need help, some boarding house sent me, as a prank." Her chest went tight. This was, she understood, precisely the moment she was meant to leave. Thank him, maybe, for not throwing anything in her direction, and walk the long hour back to town, with whatever was left of her dignity still mostly intact. Except she thought of the kitchen behind her. Thought of Loretta's smile, and the laughing, and "Don't come back till the job's done," and Mrs. Pemberton's flat rent-collecting voice drifting up, through the floorboards in the dark, and the particular kind of silence that would be waiting for her, if she came dragging back, before noon, having failed at the one single thing they'd all sent her out here specifically to fail at. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. A good deal steadier. "I need the work." He stopped. Turned. Looked at her properly, fully, for the very first time, not through her, not past her toward the jokes she represented in this territory's collective imagination, but at her, the way a man looks at a sum he's just realized he's been working out wrong, from the start. "You need it." "Yes." A pause stretched long enough to make a person's own heartbeat count out every single second of it. Then he pointed toward a broom leaning against the far barn wall, its handle worn pale, and smooth from years, and years of other hands. "Fine." His voice hadn't softened 1 degree. "You want to work? Then work. Don't talk. Don't complain. Stay well out of my way." Ruth nodded so fast her ribbon slipped an inch loose. "Yes. Yes, sir." He was already walking back toward the wreckage of the wagon wheel, before she'd even finished getting the words out. Didn't glance back once. Boots landing heavy in the dirt, with every stride. Ruth picked up the broom. And for the first time in longer than she could rightly remember, she didn't turn and run from a man's anger. she stood inside it instead. The barn was a wreck clean through. Dust hung so thick in the shafts of morning light it looked almost solid, almost like something a person might reach out and actually touch. Hay lay scattered everywhere, the way it looks when somebody's grabbed a whole armful in a fit of temper and simply flung it, which, Ruth was beginning to suspect, was more or less exactly what had happened here, more than once. Broken tools leaned in the corners like tired old men too worn down to stand up straight any longer. A saddle lay overturned by the tack wall, leather gone stiff, and cracked from neglect, the particular kind of neglect that only settles into a thing once a man's grief has grown a good deal larger than whatever's left of his capacity to care for it properly. She started sweeping. Her arms ached inside of 5 minutes flat. The dust caught thick in her throat, made her cough, made her eyes stream, and still she kept the broom moving in long, even strokes, corner to corner, because stopping felt, in that moment, like handing Loretta the very last word after all. Outside she could hear him working the fence line. Hammer against post. Again. Again. Each blow landing, with a force that had nothing whatsoever to do with the actual size of the nail underneath it. She could feel his anger traveling clean through the ground somehow, up through the old boards beneath her own feet, sharp and relentless, as a drumbeat nobody in this whole territory had asked to be marching to. Hours passed that way. The sun climbed. Her dress clung damp to her back despite the cool morning air holding steady outside. Her palms blistered raw around the broom handle, 2 spots she could feel forming even through the deeper ache of refusing, absolutely refusing, to let herself stop moving. But the barn began, slowly, to change beneath her hands. The floor cleared, one patch at a time, until the old silvered boards showed clean underneath, aged but solid, honest with that had simply been waiting under all that neglect for someone to bother uncovering it again. She stacked the loose hay into neat mounds along the back wall. Lined the broken tools up, where they'd at least be simple to sort through later, mend what could be mended, and set the rest quietly aside. She worked the whole time in the particular silence she taught herself, as a survival skill years and years back, invisible, unheard, taking up as little space in the wide world as a body her size was ever going to be permitted. Midday arrived without her noticing it, until her stomach reminded her, with a low, insistent growl. She'd left the boarding house, without a bite of breakfast, too afraid of that kitchen, too afraid of the faces gathered around that table, to risk one more minute inside that room than absolutely necessary. She paused. Leaned against the support beam. Closed her eyes just for a moment, just to steal one small breath that belonged only to her. You missed a spot. Ruth jumped hard enough she very nearly dropped the broom outright. He stood in the doorway, backlit by the high noon sun, more shape than man for one full heartbeat, before her eyes finally adjusted to the glare. There. He pointed toward the far corner, where straw still lay scattered, half swallowed in shadow. She had missed it. Entirely. Sorry. I'll fix it. He watched her a moment longer. Said nothing else at all. Simply turned and walked back out, into the light, leaving her standing there, with her heart hammering hard, bracing for an anger that, as it turned out, never once arrived. He was hard. Cold even in his own particular way. But not cruel. That was the part she truly hadn't expected walking in. Cruel, she knew exactly how to survive, had been surviving it, in one kitchen or another for the better part of her whole life. This careful, banked, contained anger that never once turned itself loose in her own direction, this was entirely new territory, and she hadn't the first map drawn up for navigating it. By late afternoon, her body had stopped complaining about specific things, and moved on to complaining, wholesale, about everything at once. A low, full-body ache, the sort that settles in deep, and lets you know, in no uncertain terms, that it fully intends to stay clear, through tomorrow as well. She climbed the ladder up to the loft anyway. Dust up there too, thick along every rafter, cobwebs strung corner to corner like something straight out of an old ghost story somebody's grandmother used to tell to keep the children in line. She was halfway, through sweeping the loft clean, when she caught the sound of boots on the ladder rungs below. He stood at the base of it, a tin cup held in one hand. "Come down!" She climbed carefully, legs trembling on every single rung now, more from exhaustion than fear at this point. He held the cup out toward her. "Drink." She stared at it. Then at him. I don't want to be any bother. You're no good to me if you go and collapse in my hayloft." His voice stayed gruff. But something underneath it had gone the smallest measure softer, like a fist unclenching itself, one stubborn finger at a time. She took the cup. Drank. Water had never once tasted like anything in particular, before this exact moment, and now, somehow, it tasted like the very sweetest thing she'd had pass her lips in weeks. "Thank you," she said, quiet. He grunted something that might, spoken by a kinderman, have passed for your welcome. Then he turned, and walked back toward the fence line, and she stood there, while holding the empty cup, watching him go, noticing, for the first time, since she'd stepped through that gate this morning, that her chest didn't feel quite so tight around her own breathing anymore. The sun went down slow that evening, painting the whole western sky in long streaks of burnt orange bleeding gradually into a deep, bruised purple. Ruth finished the loft at last. Climbed down one final time. Stood in the barn doorway, and looked out, over everything her own two hands had managed to accomplish across a single long day. Every corner swept clean. Every tool set in its proper place, straight as soldiers standing for review. The hay stacked. Even the saddle, propped upright now, though she hadn't yet dared to touch the cracked leather itself, not wanting to risk doing more harm than good to something she didn't fully understand the mending of. Something rose up slow in her chest, that she didn't have a ready name for at first. Took her a long moment to place it, it had gone, so entirely unfamiliar, over the years. Pride. He came in, from the pasture then, leading a horse by its reins, tied the animal off at the post, and his eyes swept the barn floor, before he'd said a single word. The clean floor. The organized tools. The neat, careful mounds of hay. He didn't speak for a long moment. "You're still here." Quiet. Almost, she thought, like he was speaking mostly to himself. "You told me to work. So I worked." His jaw tightened, though not with the same anger she'd witnessed that morning. Something else entirely. He stepped inside, boots echoing off the swept boards, and ran one hand slow along the nearest wall. His fingers came away clean. The girls at that boarding house. Slow. Careful, like each individual word was costing him something real to spend. "They sent you out here to fail." Ruth's throat tightened hard. She nodded. Didn't trust her own voice enough to try speaking just yet. "Why'd you stay then?" I needed the work. That all it was." She hesitated. The truth sat waiting right behind her teeth, and for one single, unguarded moment, it simply came out, without a fight at all. "I wanted to prove them wrong." He studied her a long while. And for the first time, since she'd arrived, his whole face wasn't hard anymore. It had gone somewhere else entirely. Somewhere close to recognition. "You did good work today," he said. The words landed on her like a physical blow. Her eyes stung, fast and sudden, and she blinked hard against it, willing the tears back, before they could fall, and shame her in front of a man who'd already watched her at her very worst just that same morning. Thank you?" He nodded once. Turned toward the house. Stopped in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame. "Be here at dawn. There's more still needs doing." Her breath caught. You want me to come back?" He glanced at her over one shoulder. "You want the work or don't you?" Yes, I do." "Then be here at dawn." He went inside. The door swung shut behind him, not hard, not gentle either. Simply closed, the plain way a day closes, when there's nothing more left to say about it. Ruth stood alone in the barn, as the twilight deepened slowly around her, her body aching in every place a body knows how to ache, her palms raw, where the broom handle had rubbed them. But her heart felt lighter than it had felt in longer than she could rightly count. She wasn't a joke out here. She was a worker. And a man the whole territory called the devil had told her, plain and entirely unasked, that she'd done good. The walk back to the boarding house felt shorter somehow than the walk out had that morning. Funny, how that always seemed to work. When she arrived, the kitchen sat lit and loud, the girls all gathered around the table, over a late supper, the laughter already rolling, before she'd so much as cracked the front door open. Well, well? Loretta's voice, first as ever. The joke's come back. How long do you actually last? An hour? Did he throw a bucket at you? Bet she couldn't even fit through the door. Ruth walked past the table, without offering a single word. Didn't look at any of them. Climbed the stairs, washed her face in cold basin water, and lay down on the thin mattress, with her whole body throbbing in a dozen separate places at once. Let them laugh. Tomorrow she'd be back at the ranch. And the day after that. And the day after that one too, because Caleb Reeve hadn't laughed at her, not once, not the whole day through. He'd handed her water when she was thirsty. He'd told her, plain and entirely unpolished, that she'd done good work. And in a life that had spent years finding fresh new ways to remind her she was less than she ought to have been, that one small kindness felt like the very first stone laid down in a bridge she hadn't even known, until that exact moment, she was allowed to build. Outside her tiny attic window, the first stars came out, cold and clean, and impossibly far away. Ruth closed her eyes. Thank you, she whispered into the dark. Not to the girls still laughing downstairs, over some fresh piece of gossip, already moved on from her entirely. Not to Mrs. Pemberton, asleep down the hall, with whatever quiet arrangement she'd made still sitting undisturbed in the dark corners of this house. To the angry rancher who'd let her prove, for one single day, that she was worth a good deal more than the joke this whole territory had built her up to be. Dawn broke soft and gray the next morning, and Ruth stood at the gate of Cedar Ridge Ranch well before the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills. Her body still carried yesterday's ache through every joint. She ignored it entirely. She'd given her word she'd be here. And whatever else this hard life had managed to take from her over the years, it had not yet, not once, managed to take from her the part that kept a promise once it had been made. Caleb was already up. Splitting wood near the house, his shirt clinging damp to his back despite the cool of the morning air. Every swing of the axe came down clean and controlled. But underneath that control, she could still feel it plainly, that same simmering current from yesterday, banked low now, not gone. You're early, he said without glancing up from his work. I didn't want to be late. He buried the axe head in the stump. Straightened. Studied her a moment in a way that made her want badly to look down at her own boots, except she didn't let herself, because looking down had gotten her exactly nowhere at all across 24 long years of practicing it. Barn needs mucking today, he said. Stalls haven't been done proper in a week or more. I can do that. He nodded toward a pair of gloves hanging from a nail by the barn door. Use those. Work'll tear your hands raw otherwise. She took them, genuinely surprised by the small thoughtfulness of it. Nobody had troubled themselves to protect her hands from much of anything in a good long while. The stalls proved worse than the barn floor had been. The smell hit her first, thick and sharp, her stomach rolling once hard, before she made herself steady it back down. She picked up the pitchfork leaning by the door, and set to work, load after load, into the wheelbarrow, out to the compost pile, back again for more. Caleb worked the fence line not far off, muttering low under his breath every time a board fought him, every time a nail bent sideways instead of driving true. She could catch the words drifting over, half curses, half plain frustration given voice. But he didn't throw a single thing today. Didn't break anything at all. Maybe that mattered. She thought that it very well might. By mid-morning, 3 stalls stood clean. Ruth paused to catch her breath, leaning on the pitchfork handle, sweat cutting slow tracks down, through the dust already gathering on her face. and then, voices. Female voices. Laughing. Her stomach dropped clean through the floor of her. She stepped to the barn door. Looked out. The girls. 4 of them this time, standing just past the gate, close enough to Carrie, careful to stay far enough back not to be caught doing anything a body could rightly call trespassing. Loretta stood at the front, arms crossed, wearing the particular delight she always wore whenever she discovered some fresh angle to twist the knife from. Look at her! Loud enough to Carrie, meant entirely to Carrie. Covered clean through in filth. Smells worse than the horses do. Bet she loves it. Rolling around in the muck right where she belongs. How long before Reeve sends her packing, you figure? Ruth's face burned hot clean through. She stepped back, into the shadow of the barn, chest gone tight, throat gone tighter still. They'd ridden all this way. Come to watch her fail properly. Come to see the joke land in person, close enough to enjoy every last bit of it firsthand. You girls got business out here? Caleb's voice, cutting clean through the morning air like a blade drawn fast from its sheath. The laughter stopped dead in its tracks. Just checking in on our friend. Loretta called back, sweet as poison honey left out too long in the sun. Your friend's working. He'd already set down his hammer. Was walking toward the gate now, slow, deliberate, every step landing, with a weight that made the girls shift their feet, without seeming to fully notice they were doing it. You're distracting her from it. We'll all be a good deal happier once you leave, I said. His voice dropped lower still. Rougher. You're distracting her. Leave. Now. One of the girls opened her mouth, as if she might actually argue the point. His glare shut it clean again, before a word could escape. They turned. Walked off together in a tight little huddle, whispering fast and furious among themselves, throwing one last glance back, over their shoulders, before the road bent, and finally carried them out of sight entirely. Ruth stood frozen inside the barn, hands trembling around the pitchfork handle. He'd stood up for her. Again. Caleb went straight back to his work, without another word, as though nothing at all had happened, as though he hadn't just done something that left Ruth's throat aching, with a feeling she still didn't have a proper name to give it. That afternoon, he asked her to help stack hay bales up in the loft. She climbed the ladder, muscles screaming fresh protest, with every single rung, and reached for the first bale. It barely budged an inch. She tried again. Her face going hot, with the effort of it, with the plain embarrassment of the effort. Still nothing gave. Footsteps on the ladder rungs behind her. He filled up the small loft space entirely, when he climbed up, broad enough across the shoulders, that the whole room seemed to shrink itself down around him. Here. He reached past her. Gripped the bale, with an ease that made her own struggle look almost comical by comparison. We'll manage it together. Their hands brushed. Only for a second. But she felt it like a struck match somewhere deep behind her own ribs. Next one, he said, as though nothing whatsoever had passed between them. They worked side by side after that. Bale after bale. The space between them shrinking, with every single trip across the loft, shoulders brushing, hands finding the same rope more than once, and neither one of them pulling away first. When the last bale finally sat stacked against the wall, he wiped his forehead with the back of one hand. You're a good deal stronger than you look, he said. Quiet. I'm not strong. You've worked 3 straight days, without one single word of complaint. He sat himself down on a bale, shoulders sagging in a way she hadn't yet seen from him. Not angry this time. Only tired. That's stronger than most of the men I've hired over the years. She sat across from him slowly, her heart going too fast all over again. My father, he said, entirely out of nowhere, the words arriving like they'd been sitting behind some dam of his own for a good long while. Used to hold that work was the only thing in this life that mattered. Didn't matter if you were bleeding. Didn't matter if you were sick clean through. You worked, or you were worthless, plain and simple. That's cruel. He was cruel. His jaw tightened hard enough she could watch the muscle jump along the side of his face. Beat me if the chores weren't finished by sundown. Told me straight out I'd never amount to more than the dirt caught under his own boots. Ruth's chest ached, sharp and sudden. I'm sorry. He shook his head slow, as though sorry were a coin he genuinely didn't know what use to make of. I survived him well enough. But the anger, it never once left me. Just went off somewhere else inside me to live instead. Silence sat between them a while. Not an uncomfortable one. Simply full. The girls back at the boarding house. Ruth said, voice gone low. They've mocked me, since the very day I first arrived there. Called me worthless. Ugly. A burden on the place. She looked down at her own raw hands. I started, after a while, to believe them. He looked at her then. Really looked, the way almost nobody had bothered to in years. You're not worthless. 3 plain words. Unpolished, the way everything he ever said seemed to arrive unpolished. And they cracked something open wide in her chest regardless, wide enough that tears spilled, before she could think to stop them, hot and sudden, and entirely against her own will. He stood. Crossed the small space between them. Offered his hand. Come on. Day's not over with yet. She took it. And for the first time in her whole life, Ruth Callahan didn't feel like anybody's joke. She felt seen. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither one of them spoke about out loud. Ruth arrived before the sun had fully cleared the hills each morning. Caleb was always already up, always already moving, the way a man moves, who forgot a long time ago how to sit still, and never once bothered relearning the trick of it. They worked side by side, mostly in a comfortable quiet that asked nothing further of either of them. But something had shifted between them, and Ruth could feel it in all the smallest ways. The second tin cup he now left standing by the well pump, without her ever having to ask for it. The way he no longer told her to stay out of his way, but simply told her plainly what needed doing next, as though she were somebody genuinely worth the trouble of telling. It was on the 6th day, working in a small side room off the tack area, a room she hadn't been asked into before, one he told her to clear out because, in his own plain words, "It's sat shut up since my father died, and I can't hardly stand looking at it any longer," that everything between them quietly began to change. Old furniture crowded the space. A desk, 2 of its 3 drawers swollen shut tight, with old damp. A trunk shoved into the corner, that she had to force open, its hinges shrieking loud enough to make her wince clean through. Papers. Stacks of them, yellowed hard at every edge, some gone so brittle they cracked simply, from being lifted. She wasn't snooping. She told herself that plainly, told herself twice over, because her father had raised her better than to go digging through another soul's private business uninvited. Except one single sheet slid loose from the stack and landed face up at her own feet, and her eyes caught the header printed across the top, before her mind had properly decided to look at all. Coldwater Territorial Bank and Trust. Notice of foreclosure. Her breath went shallow. She knew, plainly, she oughtn't to read a word further. She told herself that too. She read further anyway. The language swam a little at first, dense, cold, legal wording built specifically, it seemed to her, to be difficult for the very people it was meant to ruin. But underneath all that language, the plain meaning came, through clear as a single bell struck once inside an empty room. Cedar Ridge Ranch. 90 days remaining to satisfy the full outstanding balance. Failing that, the whole property entire would transfer directly to the note holder. Silas Cobb. Ruth's hands trembled hard by the time she set the page back down. She dug further into the trunk, couldn't help herself now, the way a person can help pressing on a bruise once they know precisely where it's hiding, and found still more. Letters. Demands. A running ledger of payments made, and payments missed, the interest compounding steady month over month in a hand that grew visibly tighter, more desperate, entry by entry, as the months wore on. This wasn't a rancher merely behind on his bills. This was a man standing at the very edge of losing every single thing his own family had ever held claim to. And the barn work, the notice tacked up in a boarding house kitchen, fair pay for a stranger's labor, none of it had ever been the passing whim of some hot-tempered man, who simply couldn't be bothered to keep a hired hand on. It had been the very last thing he had left to try. A man standing alone, already half-drowning, throwing out one last desperate line, before the water finally closed clean over his head. Ruth sat very still on the dusty floor of that small side room, papers scattered loose around her knees, and felt something inside her own chest twist tight and painful all at once. Because she understood it all now. Understood the fence posts hammered like they'd committed some personal offense. Understood the wagon wheel hurled clean across the barn on the very morning she'd first arrived. Understood, finally, a man who barked go home at a girl he didn't yet know, not out of cruelty at all, but because he had exactly one single thing left standing between himself and total ruin, and the last thing on earth he wanted in that moment was any witness at all to how close he was standing to that particular edge. Footsteps sounded in the yard outside, coming toward the tack room. Ruth moved fast, faster than her tired body had moved in days, faster than the ache already settled deep in her shoulders had any real wish to allow. Gathered the papers. Straightened them roughly back, into their stack, though her trembling hands couldn't be entirely certain she'd gotten the order right again. Shut the trunk lid. Latched it firm. She stood there, broom back in hand, sweeping at nothing in particular, by the time his shadow filled the doorway. Find anything worth keeping in there? His voice came easy. Entirely unsuspecting. He had no earthly idea what she now knew. No, Ruth said. And for once her voice didn't stutter at all across the single word. Just old things. I'll have it all cleared out by evening. He nodded. Turned to go. Ruth stood there, while in the half-light of that small room, heart hammering fast, a secret now sitting heavy, and entirely new in her chest, the way a stone sits once it's finally dropped down, into water gone still. She could tell no one. Not the girls back at the boarding house, God, especially not them, not with whatever quiet arrangement Mrs. Pemberton had running, with a man, whose very name wasn't fit to be spoken aloud inside her own front hall. Not Loretta. Not one living soul in a town, where gossip traveled faster than weather, and twice as unpredictably besides. And she wouldn't tell him what she knew either. Not yet. Not until she understood a good deal more of it herself, because a man, with pride enough to hurl a wagon wheel clear across his own barn sooner than admit out loud he was afraid wasn't a man who'd thank a hired girl for stumbling uninvited onto the very edge of his own ruin. She picked the broom back up properly. Went on sweeping. Outside she could hear him at the fence line again, hammer against wood, steady and relentless, a man holding a whole world together, with nothing more than nails, and stubbornness and whatever strength was left standing in his own two hands. Ruth swept the dust out of that small side room clean, until the light outside had gone gold, then amber, then finally that same deep bruised purple of evening she was coming to know well. And the whole while, one single thought sat burning steady in her chest like a coal, that simply refused to go out. Whatever this man was fighting, she was standing squarely inside the middle of it now. Whether he understood that yet or not. Whether she herself was ready for it or not. The notice tacked to the boarding house wall had said only fair pay for barn work. Nobody had told her, when Loretta dropped that paper into her lap like something already dead, laughing, that she'd walk home at the end of it carrying the full weight of somebody else's entire world along with her. But that was, plainly, precisely what had happened. And as she walked the long road back toward town, that evening, the sky closing slowly down into full dark all around her, Ruth Callahan understood, with a certainty that settled deep into her bones the way cold settles into old standing wood, that she was no longer simply some joke a boarding-house kitchen had sent out here to fail. She was standing at the very edge of something a great deal larger. Something with Silas Cobb's own name written cold across the top of it in careful legal ink. And whatever came next, she carried a feeling, deep, quiet, and entirely new to her, that she was not going to find any easy way of walking back out of it. Not now. Not after today. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither one of them ever spoke about out loud. Ruth arrived before the sun had cleared the hills each morning. Caleb was already up, already moving, the way a man moves, who forgot a long while back how to sit still, and had never once bothered relearning the habit of it. They worked. Side by side, mostly. Words weren't often needed between them, and increasingly, weren't much missed either. But something had shifted, plainly, and she could feel it in all the smallest places. The second tin cup he left standing by the well pump now, without her ever having to ask him for it. The way he no longer told her to stay out of his way at all, only told her plainly what needed doing next, the way a man speaks to somebody genuinely worth the trouble of telling. And the whole while, the secret sat lodged in her chest like a swallowed stone she couldn't quite work loose. 90 days. She did the arithmetic every single night, before sleep finally claimed her, whether she wished to or not. 90 days counted forward, from whatever date sat printed at the top of that foreclosure notice, and she didn't know precisely when it had first been drawn up, only that it hadn't been drawn up recently. Which meant the clock had already been running some good, while before she'd ever known it existed at all. Which meant it was running now. Whether she watched it tick or not. She told herself, again, it wasn't her place to interfere. That a hired girl sweeping out barns had no business going through a man's private ledgers uninvited. Except every time she told herself exactly that, another voice rose up to answer it, smaller, more stubborn, sounding a great deal like her own father, reminding her plainly that she'd been raised different from most. Raised to read a column of figures the way other girls were raised up reading from a hymnal. A mind for figures is worth more than a pretty face, Ruthie. Figures never lie to you. Except somebody's figures were, quite clearly, lying to somebody. She'd seen enough of that foreclosure notice already to recognize the plain shape of a lie even buried inside legal language. She simply didn't yet know whose hand had actually written it. It took her 4 further days to work up the nerve. She found him in the small room off the tack area, same room, the trunk shoved back into its corner, the desk still swollen shut at 2 of its 3 drawers. He sat at it regardless, a single lamp burning low, a stack of papers spread out in front of him, that he appeared to be staring at rather than actually reading. Mr. Reeve. He didn't look up. Told you already? Caleb's fine. Caleb. The name still felt strange sitting in her mouth. New. Like a coat that hadn't yet been properly broken in. I could look those over. If you were willing. That finally caught his attention. He looked up slow, one eyebrow raised just enough to ask the question, without spending any actual words on it. Look over what? The books. She made herself hold his eyes rather than drop her gaze to the floor, which proved harder than it sounded, harder than most things she managed across an average day. My father kept ledgers. For a feed merchant back before he passed on. He taught me how. Columns. Sums. I can read a balance sheet clean through. Silence. Long enough that she very nearly took the whole offer back. Very nearly said never mind, forget I ever spoke, and went off to go find something else useful to sweep instead. Except he didn't laugh at her. Didn't tell her plainly to mind her own business. Simply sat there, jaw working slow, turning the offer, over the exact way she turned, over that overheard conversation in the dark not so many nights back, hunting for the trap hidden somewhere inside it, and not quite managing to locate one. Why would you even want to? Because. She stopped herself. Started again, slower this time. Because I saw the notice. Inside the trunk. I already know about the bank. His face went hard, fast, anger flashing up sudden, as a struck match. You went through my. I wasn't looking for it. Her voice came out firmer than she'd expected, cutting clean through his. I was cleaning, exactly like you'd asked me to. It slid loose out of the stack on its own. I read 3 lines before I even understood what I was holding, and then I couldn't make myself stop reading it, and I know full well that's no excuse. But it's the plain truth of what happened. He stared at her hard. She kept going, because stopping now felt considerably more dangerous than simply finishing what she'd started. I haven't told a single soul. Not the girls. Not Mrs. Pemberton. Nobody at all. A breath. And I've been carrying it around 4 whole days now, feeling sick clean through about it, because you've been kind to me this whole while, and I've been keeping something back from you that's plainly eating you alive, and I simply couldn't go on doing that any longer. The lamp flickered low between them. Outside, a horse shifted its weight in the stall, the soft creak of old wood the only sound anywhere on the whole ranch for a long moment. 90 days, he said at last. Quiet. Flat. As though testing whether saying the number out loud might somehow make it easier to carry. It plainly did not. 62 now, Ruth said. If the notice was dated the way I believe it was. Something in his face cracked then. Not broke, cracked. A single hairline fracture running through a wall built specifically to keep everything else safely locked in. You counted it out. I count things. It's simply what I do instead of. She stopped herself before finishing that particular sentence, because instead of falling entirely apart wasn't a thing she felt ready yet to say out loud to a man she'd known scarcely 3 weeks. He studied her a long moment. Then, slow, as though it cost him something real to manage it, he turned the lamp, so it sat between the two of them equally, rather than simply in front of himself alone. All right, he said. Look them over. The books proved worse than she'd braced herself to expect. Not because Caleb had kept them poorly. His own hand was careful, plain, every entry dated, and squared neatly away exactly the way her father had once taught her a working man ought to keep his columns. The trouble wasn't sitting in his handwriting at all. The trouble was sitting in the bank's. She worked through the ledger page by careful page, the lamp burning steadily lower. As the night wore on, Caleb sitting across from her with both forearms braced flat against the desk, watching her the way a man watches weather rolling in fast, over distant hills, can't stop it coming, so he might as well see the whole shape of it clear. Here. She turned the ledger to face him. Tapped one line, with a finger already gone ink-stained, the same old familiar stain she hadn't carried on her own hand in 5 full years. This payment. March. You paid $40 against the note that month. I remember it plain. Near starved the whole herd, that month managing it. The bank's letter here says you paid $28. She flipped over to the foreclosure notice, laid it flat beside the open ledger. Look. Right there. Payment received, $28 even, applied against principal. He leaned in close. Read it through twice. His jaw went tight enough that she could watch the muscle jump clean along the side of his face. That's not, I've got the receipt. I kept every single receipt I was ever handed. Then go and get it. He was up and across the room, before she'd even finished the sentence, digging hard through a strongbox up on the shelf, with hands gone considerably less than steady. He came back carrying a small stack of paper receipts, bank-stamped, and set them down on the desk in front of her like a man laying out cards he was half afraid to look at himself. Ruth went through them one at a time. Matched each single one against its corresponding line inside the bank's own account of things. March. $40 paid out. 28 recorded. May. 35 paid. 20 recorded. July. $50. The largest single payment he'd made all year. She could see that plainly, could nearly feel the sacrifice sitting behind that particular number, and the bank's own ledger showed a mere 31. Every single one, Ruth said, quiet, almost afraid of the sound of her own voice inside that small room. Every payment shorted, near enough, by a full third. Caleb said nothing at all for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into somewhere low and dangerous, somewhere she hadn't yet heard from him, not even that very first morning, with the wagon wheel. Somebody's stealing straight from me. Somebody's stealing from you, Ruth agreed. On paper. Right where it's hardest of all to prove, and easiest of all to bury clean. And in 90 days. 62 days, they foreclose on a debt padded a full third larger than it ever ought to have been. His hands had gone flat against the desktop, pressing down hard, as though he needed something solid under his palms to keep from putting a fist clean through the wood instead. And who exactly is going to believe one rancher's word set against a bank's own ledger? Ruth looked at him. At the receipts spread out between them, small and yellowed, and entirely honest, every last one of them a fragment of the truth somebody had worked hard to bury underneath official-looking paper. I would, she said. And I can read a column of figures well enough to make even a judge believe it too. If it ever came down to that. Something shifted across his face. Not relief exactly, the whole situation sat too raw yet for relief. But something adjacent to it. The look of a man who'd been standing alone at the very edge of a cliff for longer than he could rightly remember, who had just felt, for the very first time, another set of hands close around the rope beside his own. Why, he said slow, would you go and do that? For me. Ruth held his eyes steady. Because somebody once did a kindness for me, she said. And I've spent these last 4 days learning exactly what that feels like. I'm not in any hurry at all to hand it back. He didn't answer that directly. Didn't need to. The lamp burned low between them, and outside the wind picked up against the shutters, and for a long moment neither one of them moved, as though the whole room itself had gone still just to let something settle properly into place. Then he cleared his throat. Gathered the receipts. With hands that had gone, she noticed, careful now, deliberate, as though he were handling something worth a good deal more than mere paper. We ought to sleep, he said. Long day again tomorrow. Every day out here's a long one. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The closest thing to one she'd yet seen cross his face. Yeah, he said. That it is. The men came 4 days later. Ruth was working a young gelding on a lead line inside the corral, patient, steady, no sudden movements at all, the very way Caleb had first shown her, a lesson she was slowly coming to understand, that applied to a great deal more in this life than horses alone, when she caught the sound of hooves out on the road. Several sets. Moving unhurried, the particular way men move, when they know precisely how much time they've got to spend, and mean to spend every last minute of it stirring up trouble. 4 riders came up, over the rise, and drew rein at the gate. Ruth recognized not one of them, yet by name. She'd learn all their names soon enough, and come, before too long, to wish that she hadn't. The lead rider sat heavy-set in his saddle, a wide face gone red from either sun, or drink, or some healthy combination of the two, a grin already fixed on his mouth well, before he'd spoken a single word. Well, well. His voice carried easy clean across the yard. Heard tell Reeve's gone, and got himself a new hand. Ruth's stomach dropped fast straight down through the ground itself. Not again. Heard she's a rather special kind of hand too. Laughter rose up from behind him. 3 younger men, the kind of young that trails along after an older man's cruelty simply because it's a good deal easier than going to the trouble of growing a spine of one's own. More a circus act, way I hear it told around town. How much is he paying you, sweetheart? The lead rider called out, grin widening further still. By the pound, is it? The laughter came louder this round. Ruth froze solid at the corral rail, the lead line gone slack in her own hand, her whole body wanting badly to fold itself inward the way it always had, the way it had done in every kitchen, and every schoolroom, and every street corner across her whole entire life. The barn door slammed open hard. Caleb crossed the yard fast. Not running outright, a man built like him had no real need of running, but fast enough that the men waiting at the gate straightened up plain in their saddles well, before he even fully reached them. Dale. Flat. Cold. You've come to the wrong place. The lead rider, Dale Hutchins, Ruth would learn his name soon enough, foreman over Silas Cobb's holdings north of town, spread both hands wide, all mock innocence. "Just paying a friendly call, Reeve. Checking in on you, is all. Heard some concerning talk making the rounds in town." "What kind of talk?" "Talk that you've taken up keeping company with the boarding house joke." Dale's grin didn't waver a hair. "Folks are wondering whether maybe that war left you a touch soft in the head. Or maybe you just genuinely can't manage any better than this." Ruth's face burned, so hot she thought her own skin might actually blister clean through. She wanted badly to disappear entirely. Wanted the ground itself to open wide, and carry her off somewhere far, from this yard, this moment, this laughter aimed straight and deliberate at the very center of everything she'd spent her whole life ashamed of. Caleb didn't so much as glance her way. Didn't need to. His whole body had gone rigid, coiled tight, a man working out in real time exactly how much restraint he still had left standing inside him. "What I choose to do on my own land," he said, voice dropping low, "and who I keep company with while I'm doing it, is no business of yours at all. Nor Cobb's either." Dale's grin flickered, just for half a second, just long enough that Ruth caught it plain, at the mention of Cobb's own name spoken out loud. As though he hadn't expected Caleb to say it, not out here, not in open daylight, where more than the two of them might overhear it. "Didn't say nothing at all about Cobb," Dale said, careful now, a good deal of his earlier swagger gone clean out of his voice. "Didn't have to." Caleb stepped in closer toward the gate. Closer to the horses themselves. Close enough that Dale's own mount shifted uneasy beneath him, sensing something its rider hadn't yet fully admitted to his own self. "You ride his fence lines. You drink on his coin. Every soul in this whole territory already knows plain whose errands you run, Dale, so don't sit there on my own property pretending different." Silence settled. The three younger riders had gone quiet now, trading sideways glances, the particular kind of glance that says clearly nobody in the group much wants to be the one who speaks up next. "We're only having ourselves a little fun," Dale said finally, the words coming out considerably smaller than they'd started. "Fun's over." Caleb's hand had come to rest heavy on the top rail of the gate, and Ruth could see, even from where she stood back at the corral, how white his knuckles had gone gripping it. "Get off my land." Dale stared him down a long moment, weighing something out privately behind his eyes. Then he spat down, into the dirt beside his own horse, a gesture meant to read casual, and landing anywhere but. "Your funeral, Reeve." He wheeled his horse around hard. The others followed suit. "Man goes soft, over some fat girl, from the boarding house, can't rightly say we didn't warn him plain." They rode off together, laughter trailing thin behind them now, considerably thinner than it had carried on the way in, as though even they weren't entirely certain the joke had landed the way they'd first hoped it would. Ruth stood frozen at the corral rail along, while after the dust had finally settled behind them, the gelding beside her shifted uneasy, picking up plainly on something in the air that needed no words at all to be understood. Caleb turned, crossed the yard toward her. "You all right?" She nodded. The nod itself was a lie, and the two of them both knew it plain, but it was the sort of small lie a person sometimes genuinely needs simply to get through the next 5 minutes standing upright. "They'll talk," she said, her voice smaller than she'd wished it to sound. "All through town. About you and me. About what they think. Let them talk. You don't have to go on defending me like that. Every single time." Her eyes stung, fast and sudden, and she hated it fiercely, hated that after everything, after the barn, after the ledgers, after 4 straight days spent proving she was worth more than what this whole territory had already decided about her, she could still be undone this fast by 4 men on horseback, and a handful of cruel words tossed her way. "You've already got plenty enough to fight, without taking on my own battles too." Caleb looked at her. Something had gone very still across his face. "They called you a joke," he said. "Quiet. Right in front of me. Standing on my own land. They've called me worse than that. In plenty more places than just this one. Doesn't matter one bit. His jaw set hard. Not while I'm standing close enough to hear it happen. Ruth found she had no ready answer for that. Didn't trust her own voice enough to attempt one, without it breaking clean open. So she simply stood there, the lead line still slack in her hand, the gelding nosing gentle at her shoulder, as though even the horse understood plainly that something significant had just passed between them, and wished to offer whatever comfort a horse knew how to give. Caleb reached toward her. For 1 second she thought he might actually touch her face, might wipe away whatever had gathered at the corner of her eye, and some untethered part of her chest genuinely wanted him to, wanted it badly enough it frightened her some, but he stopped himself short. Just short. Hand hovering a moment, then dropping back down to his side, as though he'd caught himself reaching for something he wasn't, yet entirely certain he'd earned the right to reach for. Back to work, he said instead. Rough. A retreat dressed up plain as an order. Back to work, Ruth agreed. Neither one of them moved for a full second longer than the words strictly required. Then they both did, at the very same instant, walking off in opposite directions, the way two people will, when they've stood too close to a fire, and both understand, without needing to say so, that some distance is required before either one gets burned clean through. It was 3 nights after that when Loretta came. Not with the others this time. Alone. On foot, which told Ruth plainly something was wrong, before a single word had even passed between them, because Loretta Vance did not walk anywhere at all. She could manage riding instead, and she certainly did not go anywhere alone, if there existed any other way around it. Ruth was latching up the henhouse for the night, when she caught the sound of footsteps out on the road. She straightened fast, heart already going, half braced to find Dale Hutchins, and his laughing shadow of a crew come riding back out of the dark once more. Instead, Loretta stepped into the last of the fading evening light, both arms wrapped tight around herself, her face gone pale, and pulled tight in a way Ruth had genuinely never once seen on her before. Loretta? I need to talk with you. Fast. Low. Glancing back over her own shoulder at the empty road, as though half expecting to find somebody standing there listening. Just you. Not him. Ruth hesitated. Every instinct built up, over 4 long years of Loretta's particular cruelty, told her plain this was some fresh trap, some new angle, some further humiliation simply dressed up now as urgency. Except Loretta's hands were shaking, plain to see even in the dim light. And Loretta Vance did not shake. Not for anybody. Not once, not in all the years Ruth had known her. All right, Ruth said. The barn, then. He's up at the house just now. They walked to the barn in silence, Ruth's own mind racing hard, through every possible reason Loretta might have walked all this way alone, in the dark, looking as though she'd seen something frightening enough to send her out on a cold road, without waiting on a proper wagon. Inside, by the light of a single lantern, Loretta finally spoke. You need to be careful. Careful of what, exactly? Of Cobb. The name came out of her like it cost something real to say aloud, as though she'd been holding it back behind her own teeth the whole walk out here. Silas Cobb. You do know who he is. Ruth's chest went tight. I know the name well enough. That's more than most folks are ever meant to know. Loretta wrapped her arms tighter still around herself, though the barn wasn't cold that night. My father's in debt to him. Has been 3 years running now. Bad crop, hard winter, borrowed against the farm just to see us through it, and now. Her voice cracked, just slightly, just enough to show the frightened girl underneath all those years of careful, practiced cruelty. Now we owe more than the whole farm's even worth. And it grows a little every single month. And every month his men come round, all polite, all friendly, just checking in on us, and every single month my father gets that much smaller. Ruth stared at her, trying hard to reconcile this shaking, frightened girl with the very same one who'd dropped a job notice into her lap like something already dead, and laughed along, while the whole kitchen laughed with her. I don't follow, Ruth said slowly. What's any of that got to do with me? Because that's plainly how he works. Loretta's eyes came up wet, and fierce all at once. He finds out exactly what you're most afraid of losing. And then he uses it against you. My father's farm. Somebody else's good name. Somebody's own daughter's reputation. A ragged breath. He likes people small, Ruth. Small and frightened, and grateful for whatever scraps he lets them keep hold of. And you and Caleb Reeve. She shook her head hard. You're not small any longer. Either one of you. Not since the two of you started fighting back plain. And men like Cobb do not let that stand unanswered. Is that why? Ruth's mind was racing now, pieces sliding fast, into place quicker than she could properly grasp them all. Is that why you sent me out here in the first place? To this ranch? Was that his idea or… No. Loretta said it fast, firm, as though the very accusation had struck something raw and open inside her. No, that part was only us being cruel, plain and simple. Girls who'd found somebody smaller than themselves to feel bigger standing next to. That's on me. All of it, entirely. Her voice dropped low, shame threading clean through it now, where fear had sat only a moment before. I'm not proud of any of it. I've thought on it every single night since the fire. What fire? Loretta's face went white. You haven't heard yet, she said, more to her own self than to Ruth. Course you haven't. It only happened last night. Barn fire, out past the Coulter place. Deliberate, folks are already saying plain. Somebody's been burning out the smaller operations that won't sell up to Cobb quiet enough or fast enough to suit him. She swallowed hard. I heard my own father talking through the wall to a neighbor man last night. They didn't know I was listening in. They said Cedar Ridge might be next on the list. Said Cobb's grown tired of waiting on the bank's own paperwork to finish its work. The words landed inside Ruth's chest like stones dropped one after another into still water, each ripple spreading wider than the last. You have to go tell him, Loretta said. Tonight. Whatever's grown up between the two of you, and don't imagine for a second the whole town hasn't noticed something's grown up between the two of you. He needs to know plain. Watch the barn close. Watch the stock. Cobb doesn't sit around waiting on paper, when the paper's moving too slow to suit him any longer. Ruth's mouth had gone entirely dry. Why are you telling me any of this? After everything between us. Loretta looked at her a long moment. Something old and tired sat behind her eyes, something that had nothing whatsoever to do with the girl who ruled that boarding house kitchen, with a laugh sharp enough to cut a body clean open. Because I know exactly what it's like, she said quietly, to watch somebody you. She stopped herself short. Started again. To watch somebody lose absolutely everything simply because a man like Cobb decided plain they were worth less than whatever it was he wanted for himself. I've watched it happen slow to my own father 3 years running now, and I've been too frightened the whole while to do anything useful about it beyond laughing along, and hoping it kept his attention off our own house a little longer yet. Her voice broke, just slightly, on those last words. I'm done being that particular girl, Ruth. I'm sorry it's taken me this long to finally say so out loud. Ruth didn't rightly know what to say back to that. For years of small cruelties, of laughter aimed straight at the softest parts of her, of a name, Ruth, sweet as poison honey, that had come, over time, to mean something close to plain dread every single time she heard it spoken aloud. And now this. A girl standing alone in a dark barn, both arms wrapped tight around herself, offering up something that looked, near enough, almost exactly like an apology, wrapped snug inside a warning that might well end up saving 2 lives before the night was through. Thank you, Ruth said finally. It was the only thing she had left standing to offer back. Loretta nodded, quick, as though she needed to move along, before the moment could ask any further thing of her than she had left in her to give. Watch the barn, she said once more. Please! She was gone off, into the dark, before Ruth could manage another word, footsteps fading fast down the road toward town, a girl walking alone, through the cold, because the alternative, waiting on a proper wagon, being seen leaving, being asked plain why she'd walked all the way out to Cedar Ridge alone, after dark, sat considerably worse than the walk itself ever could. Ruth stood in that barn alone, while after the footsteps had faded away entirely. Then she went to find Caleb. He sat out on the porch, when she came up from the barn, a cup of coffee gone cold in one hand, looking out into the dark the way he did most every night now, as though the horizon itself owed him some answer it simply hadn't gotten around to giving yet. "Loretta came by," Ruth said. He looked up, surprised plain. "The one from the boarding house? The one who's been the cruelest to me of the whole lot, every day since I first arrived there." "Yes, that one." Ruth sat herself down on the porch step, suddenly aware just how tired she'd grown, tired in a way that ran past the body, and settled somewhere considerably deeper. "She walked a full hour in the dark tonight to warn me plain. Warn the both of us." She told him everything. The fire out past the Coulter place. Loretta's own father, 3 years deep now in debt to a man who liked his people kept small. The overheard talk through a thin wall never meant for young ears at all. Cobb's tired of waiting on the paperwork. Caleb's face had gone very still by the time she finished. Still in that particular way she'd already learned meant something dangerous was moving hard underneath. "He's not going to sit around waiting on the 90 days, Caleb said slowly. 62. 62. A humorless breath, near a laugh, near enough not one at all. "Doesn't much matter now, does it? Man's plainly not interested in waiting on any calendar once he's already decided how the whole story's going to end. We ought to tell someone. The sheriff. Boone's a decent man." Caleb set the cold coffee down on the step beside him, hands gone restless, needing something useful to occupy them. "But a decent man still needs proof standing behind him, and all we've got just now is one frightened girl's second-hand account of a fire set 2 farms over." He looked at her, something raw sitting plain behind his eyes. "I believe every single word of it. That's not quite the same thing as being able to prove it out in front of a courtroom." "Then we watch," Ruth said. "Starting tonight. Every night, until we've got hold of something considerably more than just a story." He looked at her a long moment. Something moved across his whole face, surprise maybe, or something closer kin to gratitude that she'd said we, without a moment's hesitation, without waiting to be asked, as though the fight sitting square in front of him had somehow, quietly, already become hers to help carry too. "You don't have to stay out here tonight," he said. "It's not rightly your fight to take on. You keep on saying things like that." Ruth held his eyes steady now, none of the old stammer catching anywhere in her throat. "And I keep on telling you plain. I need the work." A small, tired smile. "Turns out I need a good deal more than just that too, if I'm honest. But the work part still holds true." Caleb very nearly smiled back at her. Very nearly. "Go on and get some blankets," he said instead. "Long night's still ahead of us." They took turns at the barn window, that night, watching the dark road for a threat that never quite arrived after all. And the next night the same. And the one following, that 2, 3 full nights running, until Ruth's own eyes ached, from staring hard at shapes in the dark, that turned out, every single time, to be nothing more than shifting shadow, and a restless wind working its way through. By the 4th night, plain exhaustion had worn the sharp edge clean off their vigilance. Ruth had taken the first watch, and Caleb the second, and somewhere past midnight, sitting on an overturned bucket just inside the barn door, Ruth's own eyes finally betrayed her. She woke to smoke. Thick. Acrid. Filling her throat, before her mind had even properly caught up to what her body already plainly understood. Fire. She was up on her feet, before the thought had fully finished forming, the whole world tilting sideways, with the speed of it, her eyes streaming instantly in smoke that had already gone, from thin haze to full choking cloud in what felt like a bare handful of seconds. The far stall. Flames, orange and hungry, already climbing hard up the old dry wood of the wall, already licking greedy at the loose hay she'd stacked, so carefully they're not 2 weeks back. The horses. Ruth didn't think. simply didn't have the time left to think, which was, she'd come to understand much later, likely the only reason she found herself brave enough to do what she did next. She ran straight for the stalls. "Caleb!" Her voice tore raw straight through the smoke. "Caleb, fire!" The gelding she'd worked all week screamed, a sound that went clean through her own chest like a blade drawn fast, rearing hard against the stall door, its eyes rolled white clear through with terror. Ruth fumbled the latch, her hands shaking bad, smoke burning tears down her face faster than she could even manage to blink them away. "Easy!" she gasped, her voice breaking hard against the smoke already filling her lungs. "Easy, easy now!" The latch finally gave. The gelding bolted past her, near knocking her flat, straight out through the open barn door, into the cold night air beyond. One horse safe. 3 more stalls left to clear, and the fire was climbing faster now, faster than anything had any earthly right to climb, hungry and orange, and roaring louder, with every passing second. She got the 2nd stall open. Then the 3rd. The smoke had gone thick enough by then, that she couldn't see past an arm's length in front of her own face. Her lungs burned raw. Her eyes streamed, so hard the whole world had dissolved down, into nothing but shape, and light and heat pressing in now, from every single direction all at once. The 4th stall latch simply wouldn't give. Swollen tight with heat, warped clean through, stuck fast no matter how hard she pulled against it. "Come on!" she coughed out. "Come on now!" A beam cracked somewhere hard above her, loud as a gunshot going off. She looked up just in time to watch it give way, just in time to understand, with a clarity that cut clean through the rising panic, that she likely had no more than 3 seconds left to move clear, before it came crashing straight down on top of her. She didn't have 3 seconds to spare. Arms closed around her, from behind, hard and sudden, and she was hauled backward clean off her feet just as the beam crashed down precisely where she'd been standing an instant before, splintering hard into the stall door in a burst of sparks, and burning wood scattering wide. "Ruth!" Caleb's voice, raw with smoke, and something rawer still underneath it, something that sounded, in the half-second before her mind fully caught up with what was happening around her, almost like fear held for somebody other than his own self. He half-carried, half-dragged her clean out, through the barn door, into the cold night air beyond, both of them collapsing together hard, into the dirt of the yard, coughing, gasping, the barn behind them lit up bright orange against the black sky above like something straight out of a nightmare either one of them would soon manage to forget. "The horses," Ruth managed, between coughs tearing raw at her throat. "Got the last one clear, before I ever came in after you." Caleb's hands were on her shoulders now, on her face, checking her over, with a desperation that had nothing careful left standing in it at all. "Are you hurt? Ruth? Are you hurt?" She looked down at her own hands. A burn ran angry, and red clean across her left palm, from the latch she'd fought so hard to force open. She hadn't even felt it happen, not until this exact moment. "I'm all right. I think I'm truly all right." He pulled her hard against his chest, so fast and so hard the breath went clean out of her all over again, his arms wrapping tight around her, as though he were trying bodily to convince his own self that she was really there, really whole, really still drawing breath. "Don't you ever," he said, his voice breaking hard on the words, "do a thing like that again. Do you hear me plain? Don't you ever run into a burning building for anything at all. Not the horses. Not one single thing. They would have died in there," Ruth said against his shirt, her own voice shaking now that the full terror had finally caught up with her, now that her body had at last understood exactly what it had just barely managed to survive. "I don't care about that." His arms tightened harder still. "I don't care one bit about the horses, Ruth. I care about you." The words hung heavy in the smoke-thick air between them, larger, plainly, than either one of them had been quite prepared for. Ruth went very still against him, her own heart hammering now for reasons that had stopped, in that exact instant, having anything whatsoever to do with fire. Behind them, the barn burned unsteady, orange light dancing warm across both their faces, and neither one of them moved to pull away from the other. By the time the flames had finally burned low enough to fight properly, half the barn stood reduced to ash. Caleb and Ruth worked the bucket line alone at first, no neighbors close enough to have caught sight of the glow in time, until two ranch hands riding over from the Coulter place, roused by the light lit up plain along the horizon, came riding hard down the road to lend a hand. Together the four of them saved what could still be saved. The stalls nearest the tack room. The loft, half of it anyway, scorched black clean along one whole side, but still standing upright. The horses, all four of them, safe now inside the corral, jittery and wild-eyed still, but every one of them plainly alive. Dawn found Ruth sitting on an overturned bucket outside the ruined barn, her burned palm wrapped tight in a strip torn from her own petticoat, her whole body one long single ache of exhaustion, and smoke and something else she still didn't have a proper word ready for. Sheriff Amos Boone arrived not long after sunup, an older man carrying a gray mustache, and a kind of slow, careful way of moving about that made a body believe plain he missed very little worth catching. He walked the ruins, with his hat pushed back off his forehead, crouching low here and there, examining the char patterns along the base of the far wall, with a frown that only deepened the longer he studied it. "This didn't start off any lantern," he said finally, straightening back up, his joints popping audibly in the cold morning air. "Fire like this one, starting low, starting fast, starting up in a spot, with no lamp or stove anywhere close by." He shook his head slow. "Somebody set this plane. Somebody who knew exactly what they were about doing it. We watched the road 3 full nights running," Caleb said, his voice still rough from the smoke. "Nothing at all. Then the 4th night. The 4th night the both of you finally caught a little sleep," Boone said, not unkindly. "That's precisely the night they'd wait on. A man doesn't burn a barn down on the one night folks are sitting up watching for it." Ruth's stomach turned cold clean through. "There's tracks out here," Boone went on, nodding toward the tree line past the north pasture. "2 riders, best as I can make out. Came in off the Cobb road, near as I can tell, though tracks alone won't hold up much in front of any judge, and Cobb's got plenty enough hands riding that same road on entirely legitimate business, that it won't prove a great deal on its own merit." "It's him," Caleb said, low, dangerous. "You know plain well it's him, Boone. I know a great many things I can't yet prove." Boone's eyes stayed steady, patient, the eyes of a man who'd learned a long while back that patience was about the only tool that ever actually worked in a fight of this particular shape. "And I'll tell you the very same thing I tell any man standing in your position, Caleb. You go after Cobb, without proof standing solid behind you, and you'll be the one standing in front of a judge, before the day's through, not him. Man's spent 20 years now making certain the paper trail runs clean everywhere except straight back to his own front door. 20 years. Ruth's head came up sharp at the number, though she couldn't rightly have said why it snagged so hard in her mind the way it did. Something about it sat wrong somehow, sat significant, like a puzzle piece just been laid down flat on the table, before anybody present had noticed, yet quite how it fit into the whole. 20 years. She repeated, quiet. Boone glanced her way. Give or take some. Man's been buying up half this whole territory, since before the war ever properly ended. Some of it fair dealing. Most of it. He shrugged, a tired, weathered gesture. Most of it run the very same way this fire got set. Quiet. Careful. Kept just outside whatever a court can ever rightly touch. Ruth said nothing further just then. But the number sat burning in her chest the whole morning through, 20 years, turning over and over, some old instinct she couldn't yet properly name telling her plain it mattered a good deal more than anybody standing in that burned-out yard currently understood. The sheriff left off, with a promise to go asking around some, lean a little on a few men, who might know more than they'd ever say straight out, keep watch himself on the Cobb road for the next several nights running. It wasn't a great deal. But it was something, and something sat considerably better than what they'd had standing the day before. Caleb and Ruth spent the whole rest of that day clearing debris, salvaging what timber still could be salvaged, the two of them working, through a silence that had changed its whole texture entirely, from the comfortable quiet of the weeks just past. This silence carried real weight to it now. Carried half-said things sitting inside it, half-formed, waiting patient on a moment neither one of them, yet felt brave enough to properly make. It was near on dusk, the both of them filthy clean, through with ash and sweat, when Caleb finally stopped his work and looked at her across the whole wreckage of the barn. "I meant every word I said," he said. "Last night." Ruth's breath caught hard. "Which part exactly?" "That I don't care about the horses. Not the way I care about you." His hands, black with soot, opened and closed slow at his sides, a man working himself up towards something he plainly had little practice saying out loud. "I've spent the 5 years since I came home from that war making dead certain nothing could ever get close enough again to hurt me. Land. Work. Anger mostly, if I'm being honest with you, because anger's a good deal easier to live inside of than grief ever is." He looked at her, something raw and entirely open sitting plain across his face, that she hadn't seen from him before, not even up in that loft, not even with the water and the air not worthless. "And then you walked through that gate, that first morning looking like you expected me to throw something straight at your head, and I couldn't rightly tell you when it happened exactly, Ruth, but somewhere between that morning and last night, you got yourself clean past every single wall I ever built up." Ruth's heart was hammering, so hard by then she felt certain he must surely be able to hear it plain. "I'm not." Her voice caught, steadied itself back out. "I'm not what this whole territory seems to have decided a woman's meant to look like, Caleb. I know that plain enough. I've known it my whole life through. I know full well what you look like," he said, quiet, fierce. "I've been looking at you clean every day now for 3 whole weeks running. That's not at all what I'm talking about." "Then what?" "I'm talking about the plain fact that you ran straight into a burning building for horses that weren't even rightly yours to save." His voice roughened further still. "I'm talking about the fact that you found out a fraud sitting inside my own ledgers, that a bank lawyer likely figured no living soul would ever catch hold of. I'm talking about the fact that a girl, who spent 4 solid years being laughed clean out of every room she ever walked into, still had courage enough left over to stand square in the middle of my very worst week, and say I need the work like it was the simplest thing in this whole world to say." He shook his head slow. "I don't care one bit what this territory's decided a woman's supposed to look like, Ruth. I care plain about what you are. And what you are is the strongest soul I have ever once met, war included in that reckoning." The tears came, before she could think to stop them, hot and fast, and this time she didn't even try blinking them back. "I don't rightly know what to do with that," she admitted, her voice cracking. "Nobody's ever once. You don't have to do a single thing with it tonight." He stepped in closer, careful, giving her every chance in the world to step back away, if that was what she wanted. "She didn't. I only needed you to know it plain. Especially after last night. Especially with everything still sitting out ahead of us, that I still don't have a single answer for yet." He reached out toward her. This time he didn't stop himself halfway through the motion. His soot-blackened hand came up and brushed, gentle, impossibly gentle for a hand built that size, along her cheek, wiping clean away a tear track running down through the ash and grime. Neither one of them moved for a long moment after that. The ruined barn stood behind them, black and still smoking against the darkening dusk sky, and somewhere inside the wreckage of everything Silas Cobb had tried so hard to take from the both of them, something else entirely had somehow managed to survive that fire clean through. "We're going to fight this," Ruth said finally, quiet but steady, clean through. "Whatever he sends at us next. We'll fight the whole thing together." "Together," Caleb repeated, as though testing out the plain shape of the word, deciding he rather liked how it sat resting in his mouth. They didn't kiss. Not that particular night. The moment sat too raw yet too new, too surrounded round about by smoke and fear and everything the two of them still didn't rightly know about the danger drawing steadily closer around them both. But Ruth walked back toward the boarding house that evening with her burned palm wrapped tight and aching, her whole body exhausted clean past anything she'd known before in her life, and her heart, for the first time in longer than she could rightly remember, sitting entirely unafraid of whatever tomorrow might yet ask of her. She was near to town already, when a rider fell in beside her out on the road, unhurried, deliberate in every motion. Ruth looked up, and her stomach dropped clean through the ground a second time that same day. She had never once laid eyes on this particular man before. Didn't need telling his name at all to understand exactly who he must surely be. Something in his whole bearing, the unhurried calm sitting over him, the way his eyes moved slow across her like she was some column of figures he'd already half worked out how to zero clean down to nothing, told her everything Boone's careful description had left standing unsaid. Miss Callahan. Pleasant. Almost warm, even. The particular kind of warmth that had never once in its whole existence meant a single soul well. I don't believe the two of us have been properly introduced yet. Silas Cobb. Ruth's mouth had gone entirely dry. She said nothing back at all. I heard tell about the fire. Cobb went on, easy, conversational, as though the two of them were merely discussing the weather together. Terrible thing that. These old barns dry as they run this time of year, a single stray spark, and there's simply no stopping it at all once it catches proper. His eyes held hers steady, unblinking clean through. I do sincerely hope no soul was seriously hurt in it. No thanks at all to whoever said it, Ruth said, before she could quite manage to stop herself. Something flickered behind Cobb's eyes. Amusement, maybe? Or something considerably colder, wearing amusement's own borrowed clothes. A rather terrible accusation, he said, mild. I'd be careful making one like that without proof standing behind it, Miss Callahan. Slander's an ugly business to get tangled up in a small territory such as this one. Word travels fast. Reputations. He let the sentence trail off, unfinished, the plain threat sitting well enough inside the silence that followed after it. Well, reputations are fragile things, aren't they? Especially for a young woman, with no family left standing anywhere to speak up on her behalf. Ruth's heart was hammering hard, but she made herself hold his gaze regardless, made herself stand exactly as tall as her own body would allow her to manage. I've got friends who'll speak up for me plain enough, she said. Friends. Cobb's mouth curved, something that wasn't rightly quite a smile at all. Yes. I'd heard tell you'd made yourself rather comfortable out at Cedar Ridge these past weeks. He gathered up his reins, plainly preparing to ride on, unhurried as he'd first arrived. A word of advice, then, from a man who's watched a great many souls in this territory learn this particular lesson the hard way, over the years, Miss Callahan. Loyalty shown toward a losing cause makes for a fine, noble thing to go and write down inside some storybook. His eyes went flat, cold, every last trace of that pleasant warmth gone clean out of them in a single instant. It tends to end a good deal worse for everyone involved, out here in real life. He rode on then, without waiting on any reply at all, unhurried, entirely unbothered, leaving Ruth standing alone out on that dark road, with her heart hammering hard, and her burned palm throbbing steady, and a cold certainty settling deep down into her very bones, that whatever might be coming next, it stood set to be a good deal worse than any single fire. She thought again on that number that had snagged so hard in her chest that same morning. 20 years. Somewhere inside that number, she felt certain now, sat the true shape of everything presently happening to the both of them. And she didn't yet know rightly why, but some old instinct, some voice that sounded near enough like her own father's, told her plain that number had something considerable to do with her too. Not only Caleb. Her. She walked the whole rest of the way to the boarding house alone in the dark, the cold settling deep down into her bones, and she did not manage sleep for a long while that night, staring up hard at the black attic beams the way she had, that very first night, 3 weeks and what felt like a whole lifetime back, asking that same old question up into the dark, and finding, for the very first time, the bare beginning of an answer she wasn't rightly ready yet to face square on. Why was I made this way? Maybe, she thought, drifting at last toward an exhausted, uneasy sleep that had never once been the proper question to begin with. Maybe the true question had been sitting waiting all along, 20 years deep inside somebody else's ledger, patient, for her to finally start asking it plain. 3 days after Silas Cobb had ridden beside her on that dark road, and offered up his cold, unhurried smile, they came for Caleb. Ruth was out in the corral, when she caught the sound of horses. More than 4 riders this time. A whole column of them, coming up the road, with a purpose that carried nothing playful about it at all. Sheriff Boone rode out front. That surprised her first of all. Boone, who'd walked the ashes of their burned barn, with such careful, patient concern only days before, now leading a whole party up the very same road, with his hat pulled low, and his face set in a way she'd never once seen sit on him before. Behind him rode 2 deputies she didn't recognize. And behind them, unhurried as ever, sitting his horse plain, as though he held title to the very road itself beneath its hooves, came Silas Cobb. Caleb stepped out of the barn wiping his hands clean on a rag, and Ruth watched his whole body go rigid the instant he registered, who exactly was riding up his own drive. Boone! Caleb's voice came careful, testing the ground well, before he put his full weight down on it. What's all this, then? Boone didn't dismount right off. That told Ruth something plain in itself. A man who respects you climbs down off his horse to speak with you proper. A man about to do a thing he'd rather not be doing stays sat up in the saddle, as though the horse itself grants him leave to finish the business that much faster. Caleb Reeve! Boone's voice had gone formal. Flat. A voice built plainly for reading something straight off a printed page rather than speaking honest, from the heart. I've got myself a warrant here for your arrest. The whole world seemed to tilt sideways under Ruth, the same lurching drop she'd felt the night of the fire, except this time there sat no smoke at all to lay the blame on. Arrest for what, exactly? Caleb hadn't moved an inch. Hadn't raised his voice either, though every single line of his body had gone rigid, as fence wire pulled taut clean through. Theft. Boone's jaw worked hard, as though the word itself tasted foul in his mouth. Cattle theft, off the Cobb range, 3 had gone missing this past week. And a pause longer than the first had run. Arson besides. The Coulter barn. A witness places a man matching your description close by the property the very night it burned down. That's a plain lie. Ruth's voice cracked out clean across the yard, before she'd fully decided on speaking at all. He was with me. Every single night that week he was. Miss Callahan. Cobb's voice, smooth and unhurried, cutting clean through hers like a blade drawn slow out of its sheath. He hadn't dismounted either. Sat his horse at the edge of the yard, watching the whole scene play itself out, with the calm satisfaction of a man watching a play he'd written every last word of himself. I do understand plain, that loyalty runs deep in young hearts. But a woman testifying up on behalf of a man she shares close quarters with, forgive me, a man she works so very closely alongside, carries a good deal less weight with any judge than an independent witness's word does. I don't share his. Ruth's face went hot clean through with both fury and humiliation together at once. That's a filthy lie, and you know it plain as I do. Do I? Cobb's mouth curved, thin and cold. The whole territory's been talking of it, Miss Callahan. I'd have rather thought you'd have heard by now yourself. Caleb's fist had closed tight at his sides. Ruth could see plain the fight building hard in him, the very same fight that had thrown a wagon wheel clean across a barn on the first morning she'd ever walked through that gate, and for one terrible second she felt certain he might actually do something that would make this whole moment infinitely worse than it already stood. Caleb. Her voice quiet now. Steady. Don't. He looked at her. Something passed between the two of them, not words at all, nothing so plain and simple as words, and slowly, visibly, she watched him unclench his own hands. Fine, Caleb said low to Boone. I'll come along peaceful. But I want this put down plain on the record right now, in front of every man standing in this yard, that this whole business is a setup, and Silas Cobb knows that better than any other soul standing here. Noted plain, Boone said, tired, not unkind about it. For whatever it's worth to you, Caleb, I don't much care for this business myself either. But I've got a signed complaint sitting in my pocket, and a witness statement to go with it, and my own hands stay tied until a judge sorts the whole matter through proper. How long? Ruth managed, her throat gone tight. How long will he be held? Circuit judge comes through in 8 days' time, Boone said. He'll be held that whole while, till then. 8 days. Ruth did the mental arithmetic, before she could think to stop herself, the way she always did, numbers rising up out of the panic like the only solid ground left standing anywhere for her feet to find purchase on. 8 days for a judge who never once set foot in this particular territory, before to arrive proper, hear out a fabricated case built entire on paid testimony, and decide plain whether the man standing before him lost not merely his own freedom, but every last other thing. Cobb had spent 2 whole decades circling patient the way a wolf circles a wounded animal too tired to run further. 8 days sat as nothing at all. 8 days was, Ruth understood with a cold, sinking certainty, precisely enough time for a man sitting alone inside a jail cell to be persuaded plain that signing away a whole ranch sat easier by far than losing 8 further days, and then 80 more besides, and every single day standing after that. They set Caleb up on a horse between the 2 deputies. He didn't fight it none. Didn't say another single word, in point of fact, save one, thrown back over his shoulder, as they led him off down the drive, meant entirely for her alone to catch. Ruth. Just her own name. But it carried everything inside it he hadn't found the time yet to properly say. She stood in that yard alone, while after the dust had finally settled Cobb's unhurried figure the very last to vanish round the bend in the road, and something inside her, that had spent 24 whole years learning to stay small, and quiet and apologetic for whatever space she took up in this world, went very, very still indeed. And then, quiet, cold, and entirely new, something else altogether rose up to take its place instead. She went to the tack room, that very same afternoon. Not to clean it this time through. To search it proper. Because somewhere down in her chest, that number kept right on surfacing, over and over, refusing plain to be set aside for good. 20 years. Boone had said it out loud, without much thinking, tossed off near careless, the way a man mentions the passing weather. Man's been buying up half this whole territory, since before the war ever properly ended. 20 years of Silas Cobb building himself a whole empire clean out of other people's ruin. Which meant, plain enough, that 20 years back somebody had stood, as the very first ruin he'd ever built the whole rest of it upon. Ruth didn't rightly know why her own instinct told her to go hunting for her own father inside that trunk of old, water-stained papers rather than just Caleb's father alone. Except that instinct sat, as the only thing left standing for her to follow just then, and she'd learned plenty enough these past weeks to trust it a good deal more than she'd once been in the habit of doing. She opened the trunk back up again. Worked through it a good deal more carefully this round, not merely sweeping the dust away, but reading clean, through everything, every last scrap, every water-stained page, that had somehow survived 2 full decades of neglect shut up inside a dead man's own locked-away room. Most of it proved exactly what it appeared to be on its face. Old ranch business, plain and simple. Feed receipts. A letter from some cousin back east, that had nothing whatsoever to do with any of it. Until she found the folder resting right at the very bottom, tied shut tight, with a leather cord gone stiff clean through with age. Inside sat a set of documents older still than the rest, the paper yellowed down to the color of weak tea, the handwriting careful, and old-fashioned in a way that made her chest tighten hard, before she'd even managed to read a single word of it. A partnership agreement. Dated 21 years back from the present day. Between Silas Reeve, Caleb's own father, and a name Ruth's eyes fell square upon and simply stopped moving over entirely. Thomas Callahan. Her own father. Ruth sat down hard on the dusty floor, the paper trembling in her hands, her mind refusing outright, for one long moment, to make any proper sense of what her own eyes were plainly telling her. Her father. Her own father, 5 years dead now, a name she'd carried her whole life, through without ever once hearing it connected to Cedar Ridge, to Coldwater territory at all. She'd always understood plain, that he'd once held land somewhere in this very territory, before she was ever born, land he'd lost some way she'd never rightly gotten the full story on, land he never once spoke of again, after they'd resettled some distance off, and he'd taken up the feed trade instead to see the two of them through. Except here it sat. In black ink, in a careful, old-fashioned hand. Thomas Callahan. Partner. 21 years back, before Ruth had even properly been born into this world, before any of the small griefs and cruelties that had gone on to shape her whole life had, so much as begun their slow work on her. She kept on reading, her hands trembling harder, with every fresh line. The agreement laid out a joint claim, grazing land, water rights besides, a whole stretch of range running along the northern boundary of what stood now, Ruth realized with a hard jolt, as exactly the land Cedar Ridge Ranch presently sat upon, and further land besides, running north still, into territory that, if the old survey markers still held true, would today fall square inside Silas Cobb's own holdings. Behind the partnership agreement sat still more papers. Letters this round, passed between Silas Reeve and a territorial land office, dated across the 2 years that followed, the tone growing considerably more frantic with each fresh one. A land dispute, plain to read. A forged deed, surfacing out of nowhere at all, claiming some prior ownership under a name Ruth didn't recognize, until she reached the final letter sitting in the stack, the one where Silas Reeve, in handwriting gone jagged clean, through with both fury and grief together, finally named the man he believed stood behind that forged claim. Silas Cobb. The very same man. 20 years younger then. Already, even at that age, laying down the foundation of everything he presently held. The final page tucked inside that folder proved the shortest of the lot. A single line, dated only weeks after that last frantic letter, written in a hand gone, so unsteady it barely qualified as writing at all any longer. Thomas gone. Land lost. God forgive me, I don't know how to tell his girl. Ruth sat frozen on the floor of that tack room a long, long while, the paper trembling in her raw, still healing hands, and felt the entire shape of her own life quietly, irreversibly rearrange itself around her. Her father hadn't simply drifted off, after losing his claim by pure chance. Her father had been driven out. Ruined clean through. Some part of this very land, her own land, in some fashion she was only just now beginning to properly understand, had been stolen out from under him by the very same hand that was, at this exact moment, sitting comfortable in some jail-adjacent office somewhere in town, waiting patient for Caleb Reeve to finally break under the pressure. And her father had never told her a single word of it. Not once, across all those long evenings spent at the kitchen table, with the lamp burning low, and the ledgers spread open between them, had he breathed so much as a syllable of the truth. God forgive me, I don't know how to tell his girl. Ruth pressed one hand hard against her own mouth, tears coming now fast, and silent, grief and fury tangled, so tight together inside her she genuinely couldn't tell where the one left off and the other properly began. He'd protected her from it. Spent the whole rest of his short life protecting her from a wound he'd never once let himself heal proper, carrying the full weight of it alone, so that she wouldn't ever have to. And now it had found her anyway. 20 years on. Inside a dusty trunk, in a burn-up barn's tack room, on the very same night the man she loved sat inside a jail cell on account of that same hand that had ruined her own father, before she'd ever once drawn her first breath. She loved him. The thought arrived sideways, unbidden, right in the middle of grief and fury and 20-year-old paper, except once it had arrived, it didn't leave her again, simply settled down into the center of everything else she was presently feeling, solid and entirely certain in a way nothing else sitting inside her whole scattered, aching chest currently was. She loved Caleb Reeve plain and true. And Silas Cobb had now taken something precious from both their families, 20 years apart, with that very same cold, patient cruelty each and every time. Ruth wiped her face clean, gathered the papers up, with hands that had finally stopped their shaking, and stood herself back up. Grief could wait its turn. Right now, she had 8 days standing before her. And a folder full of proof that reached back 20 years deeper than any soul presently living in this territory, yet properly understood. She rode into town the following morning on a horse Caleb had never once before let her use, because there simply hadn't been the time left to ask his proper permission, and she'd decided, somewhere across the long sleepless night just past, that permission wasn't a thing she meant to go on waiting around for any longer. Sheriff Boone's office sat at the far end of the main street, a squat brick building, with iron bars showing plain through one high window. Ruth tied her horse off, and walked straight in, without letting herself hesitate at the door even once, because hesitating, she'd learned plain enough these past weeks, was exactly the crack Cobb needed to slip his whole self through. Boone looked up from behind his desk, surprised plain to see her. "Miss Callahan. This ain't rightly visiting hours, I'm afraid. The judge don't arrive till." "I'm not here to visit," Ruth said. She set the folder down flat on his desk, her hands entirely steady by then. "I'm here because I found something you need to look at proper, before that judge ever arrives in town." Boone's eyebrows went up sharp. He opened the folder slow, careful with the old, brittle paper inside, and Ruth watched his whole face change, as he read through it, page by careful page, the very same shift she'd felt inside her own chest the night before, surprise first, then a dawning understanding, then something a good deal harder settling in behind his tired eyes. "This is old paper," he said finally, quiet. 21 years old. My own father's name sits right there on it. So does Caleb's father's. Ruth kept her voice level, though her heart hammered hard enough she could feel it plain in her own throat. "Silas Cobb didn't start with Caleb, Sheriff. He started with my father, and with Elias Reeve, 2 full decades back, and he's been building everything he presently holds on, that very same trick ever since. Forged claims. Padded ledgers. Whatever it plain takes to make an honest man look like he's the one standing in the wrong." Boone read that final page over again. "Thomas gone. Land lost. God forgive me." His jaw tightened slow, the careful patience she'd watched sit on him out at the fire now replaced, with something carrying a good deal more heat behind it. "This ain't proof he set that fire," Boone said, cautious even now. "Nor that he stole those cattle either. It's old history, plain and simple." "No," Ruth agreed. "But it's a pattern. And patterns matter a great deal to a judge, don't they? Especially when that very same pattern's still running, right inside his own bank ledger, this very day." She reached into her coat and pulled out the second folder, Caleb's payment receipts, the bank's padded entries, laid out side by side exactly as she'd first shown Caleb 3 weeks back. "Look this over too. Every single payment Caleb Reeve made against that note this year shorted a full third in the bank's own written books. Same trick precisely. Same hand behind the whole business, if you asked my opinion on it, 20 years apart or not." Boone spread both sets of documents wide across his desk, working through them all, with the slow, careful attention of a man who understood at last, finally, that he was looking down at something considerably larger than one single barn fire. "Where'd you ever learn to read a ledger like this one?" he asked, not glancing up from the papers. "My father taught me proper." Ruth's voice caught, just slightly, on the word father. Grief and plain pride tangled together inside it now in a way she made no attempt at all to hide from him. "Turns out it was worth a good deal more than he ever once let on to me." Boone sat back slow in his chair, rubbing one weathered hand hard across his own face. "This is enough, I'd say, to ask some proper hard questions," he said slowly. "Not enough, standing alone, to clear Caleb outright of the charges. But enough that I can put off that judge a few days yet. Enough that I can go digging in the land office myself, quiet, and see what else might sit buried under 20 years of settled dust. He looked up at her, something close kin to respect settling now into his tired eyes. You do understand plain what you're setting yourself up to do here, Miss Callahan. Going up against a man like Cobb, out in the open, ain't any small thing at all in this territory. I understand it plain. Ruth held his gaze steady. I've spent my whole entire life being kept small in this territory, Sheriff. Being laughed at. Being talked clean over. Being told plain what I was, and wasn't capable of by folks who never once troubled themselves to actually look at me proper. Her chin came up firm. I'm done being small. Whatever the cost ends up running me. Boone studied her a long moment. Then, slow, he nodded his own head. All right then, he said. Let's go on and dig. What the two of them found, across the 6 days that followed, built up a picture even Ruth herself hadn't fully braced to anticipate. Boone rode out to the Territorial Land Office 2 counties over, the folder of old documents tucked careful in his own saddlebag, and came back 4 days on, with a fresh stack of his own besides, records that showed, plain as day once a body knew rightly, where to look, a whole pattern of forged claims, and quietly bought-off witnesses stretching back not merely to Silas Reeve and Thomas Callahan alone, but to no fewer than 6 further families across those same 2 decades, each one ground down slow the very same careful way, each one eventually selling out, broken and beaten, to Silas Cobb himself at a bare fraction of whatever their land had once genuinely been worth. Loretta's own family sat among that count of 6. That particular detail landed heaviest of the lot on Ruth, somehow, plain proof, laid out cold in some stranger's careful legal hand, that the fear she'd heard shaking clear, through Loretta's voice, that night out in the barn had been built up on a foundation running 20 years deep, a good deal older, and a good deal more deliberate than either one of them had ever properly understood before now. Ruth rode out to the Vance farm herself, on the 5th day, the very same folder riding along in her saddlebag, and found Loretta out in the yard, hanging up wash, with hands that stilled and tired the moment she caught sight of, who was riding up toward her. Ruth. Wary. Careful. What's happened, then? I found something out. Ruth dismounted, held the folder out toward her. About Cobb. About your own father's debt. I figured you ought to see it proper, before anybody else in this territory does. Loretta read through in silence, the color draining slow from her face, page after careful page, until she reached the section Ruth had marked off, with a strip of ribbon, the very section naming her own father's farm, 20 years back, among the very first Cobb had ever circled round. He's been at this the whole while, Loretta said, her voice gone hollow clean through. My whole entire life. Before I was even born into this world. Not only your family, Ruth said, keeping her voice gentle now, all the old sharpness that had once sat between them entirely, finally gone. Mine too, Loretta. My own father. I only learned the truth of it myself, 4 days back, inside a trunk that had sat shut up 20 years. Loretta looked up at her, something breaking open wide behind her eyes. I'm so sorry, she said, and the words came out raw, entirely unguarded, nothing at all like the careful cruelty Ruth had grown so accustomed to across 4 long years. For every bit of it. Every laugh, every cruel word, every rotten thing I ever once said to you inside that kitchen. I was frightened, Ruth. Frightened plain of my own father losing everything, and too much the coward besides to do a single useful thing, with that fear except go, and make somebody else feel smaller still than I already felt myself. Her voice cracked hard. You never once deserved a bit of it. Ruth reached out, took Loretta's hand, the way not one soul had ever once taken hers inside that kitchen, across all those long, lonely nights she'd sat there alone. We're going to set it right, Ruth said, quiet, certain, clean through. Both our families. Whatever it ends up taking to manage it. Loretta's tears came fast then, and Ruth stood, with her along, while in that dusty yard 2 girls who'd spent years standing, as enemies without either one ever once knowing plain they'd been carrying the very same wound the whole time through. The final piece of it came on the 7th day, and it came from the very last place Ruth might have thought to look, her own father's Bible, tucked down at the very bottom of the single trunk she'd carried, with her these 5 years, a trunk she'd hauled along the whole, while without ever once thinking to search it proper. Pressed flat between the pages of the Book of Psalms, she found a folded document she'd somehow overlooked across 5 whole years of quiet, careful mourning. A deed. Old, brittle, her own father's careful signature sitting at the bottom beside Silas Reeve's own, establishing not merely a partnership, but a joint claim to that northern range, the very same land Cobb had forged his way into some 20 years back. And beneath that deed sat a second document, newer by far, dated only months before her father's own death. A will, naming Ruth Callahan sole heir to her father's remaining claim on that land, a claim that, by the plain reading of a deed Cobb had clearly believed long since buried and forgotten, had never actually been properly extinguished at all, merely stolen away. Which, under territorial law, as Boone confirmed, was something close to plain astonishment, when Ruth brought the whole matter to him, was shaking hands, sat as an entirely different thing altogether. He knew, Boone said, reading it through twice, 3 times over, disbelief sitting plain across his weathered face. Your own father knew, clean up until the very end, that this claim still stood good. He simply never had the money left, nor the standing, nor maybe even the strength remaining in him, to go and fight it out proper. He left it for me to fight instead, Ruth said, quiet, the truth of it settling now into her chest like something enormous finally finding its own proper shape at last. He couldn't fight Cobb himself. So he made certain I'd have exactly what I'd need to someday, should I ever find the courage in me to try. Looks plain like that day's finally arrived, Boone said. The circuit judge rode into town on the 8th day, and the whole of it turned out to see him arrive, the way small towns everywhere always turn out for anything promising to prove a good deal more interesting than one more quiet afternoon spent much like the last. They held the hearing inside the largest room the territory had standing, the church hall, its benches filled shoulder to shoulder, near half of Coldwater crowded in tight to watch Silas Cobb's own name dragged, for the very first time in 20 years, out into the open light of a proper courtroom. Caleb sat up front, thinner than he'd stood 8 days back, his jaw set firm, his eyes finding Ruth's the moment she walked through the door, and holding there steady, as though she stood the only solid thing left standing anywhere in that whole crowded room. Cobb sat across the center aisle, composed as ever, a lawyer seated close beside him, that same unhurried calm sitting draped over him like a coat he never once in his whole life found real cause to take off. The witness brought against Caleb, a Cobb ranch hand nobody present had ever seen a great deal of before, gave his testimony first, halting and uncertain clean, through under Boone's careful cross-examination, until finally, pressed hard on the exact date, an hour he claimed to have spotted Caleb close by the Coulter barn, the whole story began fraying loose at its edges, contradicting itself twice over in ways even the least attentive soul in that whole room could plainly follow along with. Then it came Ruth's own turn. She stood, and for one terrible second the old fear rose up fresh inside her, familiar as some old worn coat, the stutter sitting heavy behind her teeth the very way it always had whenever every eye in a crowded room turned itself toward her all at once. She looked over at Caleb. He didn't nod, didn't gesture at all, didn't do a single thing except hold her eyes steady, as though he already understood, better even than she did her own self, exactly what she stood entirely capable of. Ruth walked up to the front of that room, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out clear, steady clean through. Not one single stumble anywhere in it. My name is Ruth Callahan, she said, and the whole room seemed to lean itself in, that fraction closer just to catch it proper. 21 years back, my own father, Thomas Callahan, entered into a partnership with Silas Reeve, this man's own father. A nod toward Caleb. For a stretch of range running along the northern boundary of what stands today as Cedar Ridge Ranch. That partnership was broken clean apart by a forged claim. I've got the original agreement sitting right here. I've got my own father's will besides, naming me heir to a portion of that land that, under territorial law, was never rightly extinguished at all. She laid the documents down flat on the clerk's table, one at a time, her hands entirely steady clean through by then. I've got this too. The bank ledger. The receipts. Laid out side by side, exactly as she'd first shown Caleb weeks back, exactly as Boone had confirmed twice, over across the days since. Every single payment Caleb Reeve made against his note this year, recorded a full third short of what he genuinely paid out. And I've got this besides. The land office records Boone had gathered up, 6 families, 20 years, showing that very same pattern, repeated plain, against no fewer than 6 separate families in this territory across the past 2 full decades. My own family sitting among them. Loretta Vance's family sitting right there among them too. A murmur rippled clean through the crowd. Ruth caught Loretta's own name spoken somewhere behind her, caught the whole shift in the room's attention, as heads turned to find her sitting near the back, chin held up firm, unashamed for the first time in longer than either one of them could rightly count back. I am no lawyer, Ruth said, turning finally to face Cobb straight on, her voice not once wavering, through any of it. I'm only a girl, who was laughed clean out of a boarding house kitchen, and sent off to a rancher's barn, as a joke a mere 6 weeks back. But I know plain how to read a column of figures proper. My own father taught me that a mind for figures is worth a good deal more than any pretty face, because figures never once lie to a body. She held Cobb's gaze steady, unflinching clean through, 24 years of being plain underestimated sitting behind every single word she spoke. These figures don't lie there, Mr. Cobb. And I expect, should this court look closely enough into the whole matter, they'll find they've been telling that very same true story clean through 20 years running. You simply never once expected any soul small enough, nor invisible enough, to sit herself down and actually read them proper. The silence that followed sat absolute clean through. Cobb's composure cracked, just slightly, just at the very corner of his mouth, a flicker Ruth would have missed entire had she not spent 6 whole weeks learning close how to watch a man's face for precisely this sort of small, telling fracture. This is plainly absurd, he said, his voice still smooth, though something underneath it had gone considerably thin. Old papers. Coincidence, nothing more. A young woman's own imagination, grieving hard for her father, hunting round for somebody convenient to blame it all on. 6 families, Mr. Cobb. Boone's voice cut in now, flat and entirely final, the patient weight of 20 full years finally landing all at once together. Same pattern, run out 6 separate times over. I rode 2 whole counties myself to confirm every bit of it plain. That ain't coincidence at all. That's a method. He turned toward the judge. Your Honor, I'd ask this court consider not merely the charges standing against Caleb Reeve, which I believe, given everything laid out plain, before us here today, ought rightly to be dismissed for lack of any credible evidence at all, but a full proper inquiry into the whole conduct of Silas Cobb's bank, running back just as far as these records here plainly show. The judge, an older man, weathered, unhurried in his own right, the particular unhurried that comes only from having heard out every last kind of lie a courtroom's ever likely to produce, studied the whole spread of documents laid before him a long, silent while. Then he looked up at last. Charges standing against Mr. Reeve are dismissed, he said. Insufficient credible evidence behind them. A pause waited, entirely deliberate. And given all that's been plainly presented here today regarding the Coldwater Territorial Bank, I am ordering a full formal inquiry into its lending practices, effective immediate, with Mr. Cobb's own accounts frozen clean, through pending that review. The whole room erupted. Ruth barely caught a single word of it. She was already moving, already crossing the aisle, and Caleb was already up on his own feet, and the crowd parted round the two of them the way crowds always do for something they understand plain, on some deep instinct, isn't rightly theirs to go interrupting. You did that, he said, his voice rough, disbelieving clean through, his hands coming up to frame her face, as though he needed something solid to hold onto just to believe the whole thing was genuinely real. Ruth, You just went and did that. We did that. Her voice broke finally, all the steadiness of the last 10 minutes giving way together at once. Your own father. My own father. 20 years, Caleb, and neither one of us knew a bit of it, until 6 weeks back, that we'd been carrying that very same wound the whole entire while. Behind him, at the edge of the crowd, Cobb was being led away by 2 deputies, his composure finally entirely gone from him, his unhurried calm nowhere left in sight, as he shouted something out about lawyers, about appeals, about some mistake that would surely be corrected before long, none of it landing anywhere at all on ears that held any further interest left in listening to him. Caleb didn't so much as glance his way. Didn't spare Cobb a single look. His whole attention stayed fixed exactly where it already sat, on Ruth's own face, on the tears she'd finally stopped fighting off entire. I love you, he said. Plain. Unpolished, exactly the way he said every single thing that ever mattered to him. I believe I've loved you clean, since that second morning, when you came back, after I'd told you plain to go on home, and you looked at me like you weren't the least bit afraid of whatever I meant to do next. Not one soul's ever looked at me that way before. Not once, not in my whole entire life. I love you too, Ruth said, and this round the words came, without a single stumble anywhere in them, clean and entirely certain, the truest sentence she'd ever once spoken across her whole life. I believe I've loved you clean, since you handed me that cup of water, and told me plain I was no good till you collapsed there in your own hayloft. A laugh startled clean out of him, rough and entirely real, the very first genuine laugh she'd heard pass from him across all 6 weeks she'd known him. They rode back out to Cedar Ridge together, that same evening, the whole territory still buzzing on behind them, with news that would take weeks yet to properly settle down, and the ranch stood waiting for the 2 of them in the long gold light of early evening, the barn still half-scorched, still standing mid-rebuild, but standing regardless, the very way both of them stood too, changed and scarred clean, through and entirely unbroken for it. Caleb led her straight to the barn doors. The very same doors she'd once stood outside of 6 weeks back, terrified clean through, certain she was about to be laughed straight out of one more room by one more angry man wanting nothing whatsoever to do with her. This is right, where it all started, he said, quiet. Seemed fitting it ought to be right here I ask you proper. He knelt. Right there in the dirt, in front of the very barn the 2 of them had rebuilt together clean out of ash, and stubbornness, and everything else the past 6 weeks had cost the both of them so dear. Ruth Callahan. His voice shook, just slightly, the only single time she'd ever once heard it do that across their whole acquaintance. I haven't got a great deal left standing to offer you. A half-burned barn. A ranch that near went under twice over this year alone. A temper I'm still working hard at taming, and likely will be my whole life through. He drew a breath. But I've got myself a piece of land now that's rightfully half yours regardless, seeing as your own father and mine built the whole claim together, before either one of us was ever born into this world. Feels fitting, somehow, that maybe the 2 of us were always meant to go on and finish what they'd started. His eyes held her steady despite the tremor still running through his voice. Will you marry me? Ruth didn't hesitate one moment. Didn't stammer at all. Didn't feel, for the very first time across her whole entire life, one single flicker of fear about taking up space in this wide world, about being properly seen, about being exactly who she genuinely was in front of every last witness the whole wide cold-water sky could ever gather round to watch. Yes, she said. Yes, I will marry you. He rose and kissed her right there in the gold evening light, in front of the very barn, where one cruel joke had somehow, against every last possible odds stacked against it, become the truest thing either one of them had ever once found in this life. Behind them, up along the road, a small crowd had gathered, without either one of them quite noticing it happen, Loretta standing among them, tears streaming freely down her face now for reasons that had nothing whatsoever left to do with cruelty. Boone stood there too, hat held in hand, wearing the tired, satisfied smile of a man who'd finally watched 20 long years of quiet wrongs set entirely right inside a single afternoon's work. And further back still, watching on from the edge of that road with an expression no soul present could quite rightly read, stood a few of the very same girls who'd once dropped a job notice down into Ruth's own lap like something already dead, laughing. Not one of them was laughing now. Word of the wedding traveled the whole territory, through inside a single week, the way word of anything worth talking about always did in a place this size, and by the time the day itself finally arrived, near on 2 months later, the barn stood rebuilt entire, new timber standing pale and honest against the old, a fresh coat of whitewash catching the early autumn light clean and bright. They held the ceremony out in the yard, under a sky scrubbed clean of cloud, with half of Coldwater turned out to watch, the very same half that had once turned out to watch a girl fail at a joke 6 months back now turning out instead to watch her stand up straight in a borrowed dress, chin high, and become Ruth Reeve in front of the whole gathered territory. Loretta stood up beside her the whole while, the first true friend Ruth had ever rightly had, her own father's debt to Cobb's bank already quietly settled clean, through as part of the wider inquiry Boone had set rolling, the family farm standing safe now for the first time in 3 long years. Sheriff Boone gave her away, on account of there standing no father left living to do it, and he did the job proper, walking her slow across that yard with his hat held respectful against his own chest, looking, the whole while, considerably prouder than the occasion strictly called for. Caleb waited for her at the barn doors. The same doors. Always, it seemed, the same doors. "You're certain about all this?" he said, quiet, when she reached him, the old habit of testing his own good fortune plainly not yet fully broken in him. "I've never once been more certain of a single thing in my whole life," Bruce said. And when the preacher finally pronounced them man and wife, the whole yard erupted into a sound considerably warmer than the roar that kitchen table had once made at her expense, all those months back, in a cold boarding house that felt now like it belonged to some other girl's life entirely. Ruth Callahan, Ruth Reeve now, mistress of a ranch her own father had helped raise up long before she'd ever drawn her first breath into this world, stood in the arms of a man who had never once, not from that very first terrible morning onward, seen her as anything less than exactly what she genuinely was. Strong. Steady. Worth a good deal more than any soul in this whole territory had ever once troubled themselves to properly tell her. The barn behind them stood rebuilt now, scarred still here and there where the old fire had left its mark, but standing regardless, whole and sound, and entirely unbroken. Much, Ruth thought, watching Caleb's face break into that same rare, unpolished smile she'd come to treasure above nearly every other thing in this world, like the both of them. And as the last gold light of that long autumn afternoon settled soft over Coldwater territory, the joke this whole town had once built specifically to break her had become, instead, against every possible odd, the very thing that had finally made her whole.